The new book of Stefan Wul, Der Geist von Eibingen, The Spirit of Eibingen, is out now. The Temple of the Passbook jacket tags. Length novel from hack genre science fiction, State Torrid preface. Almost 15 years ago, in 1956, Stefan Wul's first novel was published in the colorful collection of the Big River Noir, which we found at the time hideous, but has since acquired an unusual charm over time. For many readers of this collection, which published with metronomic regularity stories, ending in the monotonous repetition of somewhat sloppy cosmic invasions, it was a shock. With New York, the second novel, released at the beginning of 1957, the shock turned into pleasure. Finally, one held in a field that seemed to remain the fief of the Anglo-Saxons, a good, an excellent author. There were undoubtedly not lacking then intelligent and elegant stylists of French science fiction writers, but, perhaps too ambitious, they all claimed almost of satire or poetry. The space opera, this novel of lively action grafted on the science fiction problem, and flavored with suspense, remained almost closed to all except Stefan Wul. But not only did Wul show himself capable of beating the Anglo-Saxons in space opera, but he was also capable of poetry, and did not despise joining a point of satire. The enchantment lasted 11 books. Then Stefan Wul, tired of the difficult material conditions in which he wrote, returned to other pursuits. However, success had been immediate, considerable, and lasting. On the second-hand market, which is perhaps the most severe critic that an author has to face, the prices of these, Stefan Wul's novels, although they have become progressively more modest over time, have multiplied by 8 or 10 in relation to their original value. They have become hard to find in school or municipal libraries because they were stolen, and some collectors are said to keep their copies in vaults. Unfortunately for Wul and his potential readers, indeed, it had been published in a series that, for management reasons probably solid, but very regrettable, ignores reprinting. A book must kill the other. The voluntary popularity of this collection will surely prevent Wul from giving full measure to his talent, and these two factors in combination lead him to give up a well-begun literary career. His last manifestation dates back to 1961. He made an appearance in the 87 issue of Fiction in February with a relatively old new story, Gwendolen. It is not often that an author returns to their pen under the pressure of the public, otherwise in the annals of the best popular literature. There is, however, a strong chance that Stefan Wul will be forced to do so. Unless for the moment only new works are published, the lost novels of Stefan Wul are to be gradually republished. The Presence du Futur collection is soon to include New York, which may be his most finished book, and I am happy on my part to render in this volume to its former admirers, and offer to new readers 3 of his most daring works, the richest inventions. At the same time, a cinematic adaptation of his novel En MS en série, it is preparing for Prague under the direction of René Laloux. It will be an animated film whose models were designed by Roland Topor. The first quality of Stefan Wul is that he is a visionary. He is able to describe with extraordinary concreteness strange landscapes. The realism of his visions comes from their consistency. He does not content himself, like many others, with simply painting unusual colors on otherwise mundane panoramas. He succeeds in suggesting foreign geologies and ecologies to our planet. Instead of paintings, he proposes structures that one is tempted to consider functional. Without a doubt, he owes this ability almost as much to the scientific culture demanded by his profession as to an innate talent. But where talent comes into play without any help is when it comes to choosing the angle of view, and here either Wul does not miss. The landscapes of Zarkas, among others, will remain engraved in the memory. The second feature of Wul is the taste for the paradox, sometimes pushed to the extreme, as in The Orphan of Perdide, which made some cry hoax. And so what? Hoax is an active form of poetry unless it's the opposite, and the best science fiction must be excessive. Another of his qualities is to extract the maximum from the subject while giving the impression of leaving some of it. His main weakness, which is often found in the space opera genre, lies in the often stereotyped nature of his heroes, which contrasts with the more detailed and true characterization of the supporting characters. Noteworthy exceptions are the black child of Nayok, the biologist Joachim of the Living Dead, and the astronaut Messier of Temple of the Past. 7. It is striking that the attitude of these characters towards other forms of life is open and benevolent, while that of the more conventional adventurers is not devoid of a certain condescension towards the natives. But these are trumped-up charges. There is, on the other hand, with Wul, all things considered, something of the breath of Malraux, the fantasy of Boris Vian. Like at Malraux's, his heroes oscillate between the quest for wealth and that for truth and end up discovering solidarity. They know they are insignificant and mortal, drifting between constellations and show concern for bringing life to fruition without metaphysical reasons, because it is life. Like at Vian's, they find ironic continuation in their environment, and their tragedies gladly dressed with humor. The inherent limitations of a very popular series, which at the time could only accommodate and pay him almost decently, as it did for other talented writers like Kurt Steiner. The labor involved in earning his keep from meager royalties didn't allow Wul to achieve his full potential. I repeat myself here, but it is true. He was never able to reach his full measure. His having succeeded in these circumstances to captivate and retain for 15 years a loyal audience is enough to give a promise for the future. One is inclined to dream of what he would have written if he had lived in the U.S. and found 10 magazines, 20 collections, and 100,000 readers welcoming him, without restrictions. But this man is terribly active. He takes up sculpture when he isn't digging a swimming pool in his garden, and I have no doubt that having found a new audience one day soon, he'll start back up on his machine and keep all his promises. Jared Klein. New York. Anticipation Collection. Anticipation No. 83. Editions Fleuve Noir. Sida Series. Anticipation Collection No. 90. Editions Fleuve. The Giant Fear Anticipation Collection No. 96. Editions Fleuve Noir. Omes in Series. Anticipation Collection No. 102. 102 Editions Fleuve Noir. The Temple of the Past. Anticipation Collection No. 106 Editions Fleuve Noir. Fiction No. 43 June. Anticipation No. 109 Ed Flèche Noire. Échec au plan 3 New. In Satellite No. 1. January 1958. La Mort Vivante. 17. Ça va dans rien new. In satellite, no. 5 May 1958. Expertise new. In fiction. May 1158. Flèche noire. Terminus est. Call. Lily Ed, River of Black, 1959. Odyssée sous contrôle, Anticipation Series, 138, River of Black. The Vestales Games short story, in Fiction Special, Volume 2, June 1960-1961. Wendelin short story, in Fiction, Volume 87, February 1961-1970. Works: The Temple of the Past, Trap for Zarkas, The Living Dead Revised, and Expanded Texts. Elsewhere, Come Tomorrow, Classics. Robert Laffont. Robert Laffont. 1957. New York. Anticipation Series. The Temple of the Past. De Noël Edition. The Temple of the Past, first part 1, a complaint, and then this call, Messiah, another complaint in the heavy night close, like a metal boundary, and then the hoarse call. Messiah. Hot. Messiah was too hot. Who called him? He opened his eyes, saw nothing, just darkness. He made a gesture to stand up and groaned in turn, twisted by the pain that was digging into his chest, piercing his neck. He plunged back into unconsciousness, underwent a painful journey through a country of black velvet, crossed with lightning and phantasms. He felt himself shrinking, reaching the size of a child, a baby lying in its cradle. The cradle's motor was supposed to creak, for instead of rocking gently, it was swinging with cruel amplitude. From high above down, from low below up, dizzy, with clenched teeth, his heart in his throat, Messiah tensed his fingers on the edge of his bed with all his might. A new pain awoke him, bringing him back to manhood, to reality. He had torn his hand on cutting metal. The swing stopped. Messiah was no more than a heart pounding in the deafening rhythm, a cautious breath-hold feeling his chest's broken ribs with gentle caresses. Messiah. He dared not answer. The voice resumed its lament. Very close. The complaint was so forced and melodramatic that Messiah wanted to laugh. He knew where he was, what was expected of him. In a neighboring room, the examiners were waiting for his nerves to fail. But no, by the gods, he would be a pilot. And one could vary the tests, the sufferings, the hallucinations, infinitely without any result. He would prove to them that he had an irreproachable morality, hard as steel, that he was resistant to intersidereal dementia. Messiah, God, I am in pain. Always asked, thought Messiah. The sweat flooded his face. The examiners were going a little too hard. They would tear his chest open. It was their pleasure to try and file a single complaint against a naked man, tied up and given over to the sadistic amusements of his tormentors. But he shouldn't complain, or they'd tell him with fake sympathy that since he couldn't bear the trials, he wasn't fit for long voyages. It would be a true condemnation to mediocrity. One would be assigned for life to a regular line with no glory. Earth-Moon, or strictly speaking, Earth-Mars. Why not fly an air omnibus? Rather die. You haven't soaked in 10 years of upper-course algebra to give up at the last moment. Messiah smiled in the shade. He decided to call it a day. He was going to demand a changeover. It was the only acceptable reaction one could expect from him. Without moving, he spoke in a calm voice. Hello, he said. About 5 minutes ago, hallucinations and pains. Go to pilot 2. Cap. The cap, by the gods. He had forgotten the cap. Numbers crowded into his brain. This time he was good for the reform. "Oh, Monsieur, you're crazy," the voice said. Another complaint. This time, Monsieur wondered if the voice was right. Was he mad? The voice went on. "You're not at the center." "You're in, how I hurt Monsieur. We're in 1313. Do you hear me, Monsieur?" Slowly and carefully, Monsieur leaned to one side, straightened himself on one elbow. His head hit a metal beam. He was about to yell. "God, you're alive at least. Crazy, but alive," said the voice. Monsieur recognized the voice, that of Fatto, the navigator of his team. This time he understood. Memories returned to him, vivid and clear. He had been a pilot for 7 years. School was a distant, foggy memory. He felt happy despite the pain. He chased the nightmare away. He was a good pilot. Pilot F-1313. "I'm not crazy," he said. "I lost my pedals for a moment, but it's over now." "What happened?" The navigator was slow to respond, and Monsieur could hear him gasping for breath. "Where are you hurting?" he asked. "I hurt. Do something." Monsieur groped his way left-handedly, feeling for the switch. He didn't find it right away because the object seemed to have changed places and was much further back, a meter from his bunk. He pressed the button without getting any light. Just a dry click. Strangely enough, this sound cleared the last mist from his mind. Until now, he was still asleep, and accepted as one does in a dream all the strange aspects of the situation. He got up, leaning against the partition. "We've had an accident," he said naively. No answer. "Fatto," he cried. "We have fallen, haven't we? Where are we?" "Fatto, don't you feel pain anymore? Are you sleeping?" "Fatto, reply to me." He was sweating profusely, his eyes wide open in the darkness, his brow wet and pressed against the metal partition, his hand pressed against his aching chest. "Fatto!" He stumbled forward into the shadows, encountered unexpected obstacles, crossed the whole length of the cabin, and felt for the navigator's bunk. Empty! "Fatto!" His hands touched the other partition. He bumped again on a pile of soft laundry, wanted to bend down, repressed a cry under the bite of pain. "Very straight." He knelt and touched Fatto's face. He felt Fatto's hair, his nose, his cold teeth with his fingers. He didn't feel his companion's regular breath. Afraid, he shook him. Fatto. He understood that Fatto would never answer again. Until then, his companion's moans had hidden other noises, a background of gurgling and grating metal. He felt as if he were hearing the whole rocket moan in turn, fatally wounded. Under the bulkhead, pipes were hissing violently. Somewhere, wrenched panels were vibrating under the torsion. A liquid was oozing out, ringing a subtle bell on a hollow surface. What liquid? Water, fuel, thermal fluid. And 20 or 30 different pipes flashed through his mind. One quickly gets used to considering one's apparatus as a living being. Nasir imagined the rocket gasping, losing its fluids like a man loses his blood and lymph, his bile and all your souks, by 100 wounds. Something was whistling in the depths of the spacecraft. A gas was leaking out. Which one? Air. Nasir was afraid. You couldn't let the rocket burn up, damn it. That would be condemning yourself. And the others? What were the others doing? Were they all dead? Was the rocket a sarcophagus for 30 corpses? He called out. "Ho, guys!" His voice was drowned out by very short, tortured echoes from the Baroque acoustics. He walked cautiously towards the door, found it blocked by a heavy, unmovable obstacle. He punched and called again. Soon he realized that he could only count on himself and sought light. Light above all else. This helplessness of a blind man was the first thing to overcome. On his hands and knees, exploring the floor inch by inch, it took him a good quarter of an hour before he reached his lamp. It had rolled underneath his bunk. He pressed the button and nearly cried with rage. The lamp didn't work. Restraining himself, he unplugged the lamp, ran his finger along a wire, felt the break, lost it, went through the trick 10 times, sweating at his temples. Finally, his finger pushed the wire and re-established contact. 11 tried to keep his hand stiff in its position and swept the cabin with a bright brush. The wardrobes had vomited boxes of instruments and books onto the floor. A powerful shock had warped the metal flooring. Concave. It seemed curved like a hammock under the weight of the debris piled up in the middle of the room. The flabby tattoo? Fato's face grinned up at the ceiling. The navigator had a beam lying on his belly, his lifeless hands clenched on the metal as if to rip it out. Monsieur's couch made a weird angle with the partition. Its misaligned legs had tipped it over. It blocked the door. A twisted hand with a cramp, but wrapped tightly around the lamp. Monsieur hobbled through the mess between him and the toilet cubicle. He was thirsty. He came in and picked up a cup. He opened one of the taps on the sink. It hiccuped 2 or 3 times without result. Monsieur put his finger under the spout. The tap suctioned to his skin. The water was flowing back into the pipes and going to waste. Somewhere he didn't know. He tried the shower and, disappointed, threw down the cup on the floor. His gesture of anger cost him a stab in the chest. He let go of the lamp and found himself in the darkness. Desperate, he sat on the edge of the shower tray and remained motionless for a long time, watching the spasms, the gurgles, and the groans of agony of the great apparatus. He closed his eyes and began to shiver. The sweat soaked through his underwear. He did not know if he was falling asleep in his discomfort. TM precise noises brought him out of his stupor. Swishes came from the passageway, then regular impacts like footsteps, then a curse. A surge of hope flooded Monsieur. "Who's there?" he said. To his surprise, his hoarse voice was only a whisper. He ran his tongue over his lips and repeated louder, "Who's there?" "Oh, it's you, Lieutenant," said a youthful voice. "Here." Jolt. The apprentice. Monsieur jumped up and groaned. "What's wrong?" the voice asked. "Do you have something broken? Where are you?" Monsieur took a breath. "Which lieutenant are you talking about?" he asked in a mushy tone. "If it's Fato, he's dead. I'm Monsieur." A small silence, and then, "Glad to find you alive, Captain. You're stuck. In my cabin, yes. There is no way to open this door." "It's stuck with my cot. I think I have broken ribs." "We'll try to fix that," said the young intern. Monsieur made an effort not to cough and asked, "And you, Jolt?" "Scratches and a sprained wrist." "What happened? I don't know. I was sleeping. And the others, well, up to now." The voice broke. "Well," said Monsieur, "all dead, but I didn't visit the whole of the ship. I'm glad to have found you. Listen, Jolt, do you have any light? I have got a torch. You're finished. Could you try to cut my door with a torch?" In the meantime, Monsieur had moved closer to the door, dilated by the immense joy of having an interlocutor. "A torch? I don't know. I'll try to find one at the workshops if I can get there." "Good luck, kid. Rest well, Captain, and trust me." The steps moved away in the corridor. Monsieur felt around for his couch. He lay down with a sigh, trying to remember the last hours of his consciousness. He had handed over the controls to the co-pilot at sidereal time, B-15. Or rather, he had done so in a platonic way. Let's say that the other then passed them on to the monitoring of the autopilot. The rocket was leaving the orbit of Planet 8 and escaping System 1. Cruise speed. They were supposed to reach A2 within a month. Exhausted, Monsieur had fallen asleep, and yes, now he remembered it all. A very brief nightmare, a feeling of free falling, and then nothing. With painful awakening in the darkness, with the calls of a failing navigator. Monsieur turned his head toward where the corpse lay. It was a long, very long. But when a narrow tear split the metal door, Monsieur found solace in seeing Jolt smile. He seemed to have aged in a few hours. The fatigue was carved into his features by the lamp's light. He had a bandaged head and rosy cheeks from young beard. Sweat had etched lines in the dust on his forehead. He passed a flask to Monsieur through the doorway, then placed a sandwich on his cot. Monsieur's appetite was sapped by Jolt's revelations, so he asked the apprentice questions with no possible answers. "I heard someone screaming," said Jolt, "but how do you know who? I can almost say that there are many of them. I tried to go through the central passage, but it is." He clapped his hands together. "Flattened? The ladder?" said Monsieur. Jolt shrugged his shoulders. "The ladder goes down into the liquid. Fuel floods the whole lower deck. A whole tank 4 had to have poured into it. I believe even that the level is still rising. I ran away before being suffocated. Calm down. The door is well sealed." I held the steering wheel with all my strength. Monsieur thought for a moment. "They must be in the relaxation, or in the central dormitory." "No," said Monsieur. "If the tunnel is damaged as you saw, the dormitory has taken a terrible hit. They can't be down in the hold either, since the fuel has flooded everything. They're in the rec room. So there are only two ways to get to them," said Joe. "Either cut through 20 meters of damaged bulkheads with a torch, or dive into the fuel in spacesuits. Or we don't have enough reserves to feed the blowtorch. And besides, it would take weeks of work. As for the diving helmets, we should move quickly," cut Monsieur short. "The fuel would eat away at the joints in a quarter of an hour." Jolt opened his mouth to object, then seemed to change his mind, and picked up the blowtorch again. "He must get you out of here," he said. He removed his mask. A silent flash appeared to shoot from his gloved hands. The hot brush bit into the alloy of the door. The latter gradually blushed, illuminating the cabin with an infernal light. Monsieur had stretched himself on his cot. He couldn't help his rescuer in any way. He could only wait, and his impotence weighed on him. He had to give up shooting at his bed the corpse of Fado. His broken ribs prohibited any effort. Rocked by the hiss of the torch, he fell asleep and dreamed of Naid. Naida was on her terrace at Tlante, capital of Earth, capital of all known world. Naid was beautiful, as always, the very embodiment of beauty. Standing in her long, translucent tunic, she looked down at the golden roofs of Tlante, the river's curve, and then the sea shrouded in morning mist. A subtle irony corrected the sadness in her green eyes, barely raised the crease in her lips, feminized the too great perfection of her face. Suddenly, the sky rumbled, and Loops played on his forehead, held in place by a small circle of gold. 11 swung nay-eyed into her bare arms, and lifted her up into the air, as if he wanted to offer her to the gods. Then he held her close to his chest, and kissed her. Nasir was horribly jealous of this blue-eyed giant. Then he recognized him. It was himself, Nasir, 10 years younger. He made a gesture and woke up in a jump, tied by pain. At the same moment, the door cracked all its seams. Nasir turned his head and saw that the gap had grown larger. He asked, "What are you doing, Jolt?" The intern passed a torch through the opening. In his smiling face, "It's coming, Captain," he announced. But no more chattering, the battery's dead. I finished the job by hand. He was waving some huge stick around. "What is that?" asked Nasir. "I unscrewed a leg of a table," said the intern. "It makes an excellent lever. Give me 5 more minutes and I can go." "We can," corrected Nasir. The intern shook his head. "No, sir, not you. With your fractures you can't do this exercise. Let them heal first." Nasir slowly sat down and put his feet on the floor. "I'll help you. Your wrist must be bothering you." "No way. I don't use it. I support with my forearm." "Stay calm then, Captain." Jolt returned his head to the passageway. He was heard moaning in effort. The tin ripped a little more. A big gash threw a triangle of light into the cab. Jolt's hand explored the edges of the open. "This time, it'll be okay," he said. "I'm going to hammer this flat so I don't cut myself when I go through." He began to bang away like a maniac on the metal. Nasir clenched his teeth, not admitting that the noise was reviving the pain in his neck. He bravely endured the commotion. A little later, Jolt taped up the ragged edges of the hole. Then he jumped into the room and, lamp in hand, approached Nasir. "Don't move," he said. "Let me see this." Skillfully, he undressed the wounded man without doing him any harm. Then he questioned, "Did you wake up lying on your back?" "Yes. That's better, though. Finally, we'll see. Where do you hurt?" Nasir gently rubbed his sides, pointing to a couple of spots. Jolt gently pressed his finger onto Nasir's chest. He gradually increased the pressure. "Ouch," said Nasir. "Yes, that's it. You have good veins. It's an external fracture. The others are probably the same kind. The lungs, don't be afraid of them. The fractures are external, I tell you. And there. Ouch. Okay. Breathe quietly. Again and again." He quickly located 3 fractures, and after a smile, he left to go down the corridor. "I'll be back. My dagger is all over the place, but it's not too bad. I bring what is needed." 10 minutes later, he opened a large box on the bedside of his patient. He began by fixing some damp cups with electrodes and applied current from a battery. The beneficial ions neutralized the pain in a matter of moments. Nasir stopped suffering. Jolt changed equipment, fixed some cups here and there. "Inflate your lungs to the maximum," he ordered. "Don't deflate them until I've counted to 30. Go! 1, 2, 3, 4. Nasir obeyed. The vigilant ear of Jolt discerned the cracking of bones. This ion-carrying current gradually laid down metallic particles around the fractures, then thicker, concentric layers. When Jolt approached the 30 mark, he stopped counting. "Very slowly," he said. "You can breathe. Stay like that for a quarter of an hour, and you'll be on your feet. I'll demetallize you in a few weeks. If you speak, Go easy. And don't cough. And my head? Asked Monsieur. Don't move. Don't exert yourself. I'm going to take a look. He carefully lifted Monsieur's neck and was content with a quick galvanic anesthetic. You just got hit good. Nothing broken. Monsieur shot him an intrigued look. And you, old man, what's that around your skull? It's not the skull. It's the ear that's half ripped off. I lost quite a bit of blood. But after drinking a lot and getting a transfusion, I feel much better. Suddenly, the whole rocket cracked as a giant sound of boiling water rang out in echoes across the steel plates. "Don't move!" Jolt exclaimed. "What is this?" The clarity of the lamp's light cast a sinister visage upon him. "Whatever happens, try not to move," he repeated for what felt like the 1,000th time. They both felt as if they were falling slowly. Inexorably into a viscous world. Jolt had clenched his good fist on a rail of the cup. They could all see the anxiety in each other's eyes. Nonetheless, they turned to a sneer of smugness. "I wonder what lies ahead." I whispered. "We know next to nothing about our situation." They remained immobile for a long moment, watching the unknown. Slowly, Jolt leaned forward to keep his balance, and Monsieur felt himself slipping from the cot. The rocket was gently tilting onto its side. Feverish, the apprentice looked at his watch and turned off the power supply. He unscrewed the electrodes. "You can go ahead now," he said to the pilot. "It will hold out now." Monsieur sat down on an unstable balance and adjusted his clothes. The disappearance of his pains did him a lot of good morale. In spite of some fatigue, a feeling of recovered strength flooded him. A US-2, he thought. A US-2. He was vague. He was addressing fate, adversity. God or the devil, he would have to count on Monsieur, with the force of Monsieur, with the will of Monsieur. He got up and walked towards the toilet cubicle. "What are you doing?" asked Jolt. "I'm getting my light. Please brighten me up a bit." Jolt followed him. It was almost as tall as the pilot, but looked weak in comparison. Monsieur kicked away the debris that covered the cockpit and grabbed a screwdriver, fixing his light in 2 minutes. He hung it around his neck. Then he bent down over Fatto's body, swung the crossbeam with one arm, and carried his comrade on his bunk. He draped a sheet over the face of the corpse and tightened strappings to keep it from sliding. He looked at Jolt and saw that he was surprised. "I know it doesn't help anything," he said defiantly, "but I couldn't stand seeing him on the floor. You'll have to move him soon," the intern remarked. "It will stink soon." "They'll all have to go somewhere else," Monsieur said as he slid his broad shoulders through the doorframe. He leapt across and groaned, a hand on his side. "It's nothing," Jolt said as he caught up with him. "The anesthesia is wearing off, but don't worry about your ribs. They're stronger than before." On the steep floor of the corridor, they walked towards the end of the craft. On the way, they jumped over 3 mangled bodies that were unrecognizable. "Have you tried looking outside?" inquired the pilot. "No," said Jolt. "I couldn't. As a doctor, I don't have screen keys." Monsieur entered the tail cockpit. He pulled a key from his pocket and opened all 4 screens. "There is little chance of seeing anything," he murmured. "Without power. Maybe a battery still works." Monsieur pressed the button on the first screen. Nothing. The plastic kept its silvery hue. Blind. Second screen. Nothing either. Third. But yes. The screen turned black all at once. Ink black. This one worked, but it didn't help them much. "We're in a dark corner," said Joe. "Yeah," groaned Monsieur as he pressed his forehead to the plastic in an attempt to make out something. And then he shrugged and opened the last screen. Same thing. It was black. He slowly lowered the shutter, but his gesture was cut off by Jolt. "Stop! What? Look!" The apprentice pointed to something on the glass. A small stain. Nothing much. They leaned in, holding their breath. "It's moving," said Messire. "What is it?" "A small creature." "Eh?" He stopped, searching for the right word. "A mollusk, I think." "By the God! There's life wherever we are." "In this corner." "Not exactly reassuring," said the apprentice. "It depends," said Messire. "In principle, it means there's a chance of food." "I like this better. I'd rather stand up to the beast than the ice planet's trap." He staggered suddenly, grabbed the railing with one hand as Jolt pirouetted at the other end of the room. The rocket was shaking like a giant bell, swaying scrap and dead meat on all levels. When it stopped, Messire let go of the railing and jumped upright to the opposite partition, which had become floor by the machine's turn. He felt like a fly on a wall. He approached Jolt, who stood up clacking his teeth, and put his hand on his shoulder. The intern mocked himself. I'm not afraid," he stammered. "I'm sure of it. But it's he who trembles, my body, no way to. It's ridiculous." "I know," said Messire. "You shouldn't be ashamed. A body is sometimes more difficult to control than a rocket." The pilot put his hand in his pocket. "It's time for the doctor to play." He smiled as he pulled out a tube. He slipped 2 grains between the teeth of Jolt. "Swallow it," he said. "I know this kind of trouble, and I always have what's needed on me." Jolt obeyed. Slowly, his tremors subsided. Finally, he could speak normally again. "It's just as silly and inexplicable as hiccups," he sighed, throwing his eyes around. Then he opened his mouth and pointed a finger at the screen. Messire quickly turned around. The screen split in 2 at the oblique middle. It wasn't empty. A rosy substance was blocking it. It looked as if some joker outside stuffed it with wet rags. The 2 men knelt down, directing their lights at the glass. Up close, the substance appeared spongy, teeming with tiny creatures resembling the mollusks spotted earlier. Tiny, gaseous bubbles ran about, gathering into iridescent slime, emerging from the critters or the strange matter. Nobody knew. "What is it?" said Joel. "It could be anything," Messire cut in. "It looks like mashed brain churned up by leeches. It makes me sick." Decisively, he lowered the lid and closed the screen. He stood up. "I don't care to know what it is," he said, closing each screen in turn. "We wanted to see. We did. And then, do you think vision is the most important means of investigation?" "No," I exclaimed. "Let's take external images, analyze them. Let's verify the environment, pressure, radioactivity, who knows what else. Our instruments are smarter than our senses." "If the instruments are within reach," said Jolt, "but they're on the other side of the machine. And there are 20 or 30 meters of obstacles between us and them." "Okay, old man. That's why the first thing to do is to go find the guys." To get through the corridor again, they had to pull themselves up by the handrails, the door being at ceiling height. Using the handrails as support, they were able to climb higher with their wrists alone. Messire had to struggle to support the injured trainee who was handicapped by his sprain, but the incomplete verticality of the corridor aided their ascent. They reached the pre-SAs, the hatches stuffed with dive suits, and rested there for a moment. "It's weird, the morale," Messire coughed as he rubbed his side. "I almost hurt as much as just now, but since I know you've adjusted the pieces, I'll go all out." He was looking for an opinion from the doctor. The latter finished reassuring him with a nod of the head. "And your wrist?" "S'informa le pilote." "Ça va. Je veux dire, pourquoi ne l'avez-vous pas soigné?" Jolt eut un geste évasif. "Ce n'est pas la même chose," dit-il. "C'est moins grave, mais beaucoup plus délicate qu'une côte brisée." Massir souffla encore un puis il désigna ses pieds. "Je m'aperçois seulement que j'ai les pieds nus. Vous devriez faire comme moi et retirer vos chaussures. They weigh you down, and that's it." "You're right," said Jolt, as he unbuckled the belts. "I wonder why gravity control isn't working anymore. Some of the screens are still working. And if the battery—" Nasir waved these worries away. "We'll deal with that later," he cut in. "I'm trying to get rid of as many thoughts as possible from my mind. Let's proceed in order and go." A chirp interrupted them. With a racing pulse, they lifted their noses to the intercom. "Hey, Prisas," a clear voice said. "Hey, Nasir," said. "Finally, you. By the gods, I had a hard time finding you." The voice cut in. "How are things in your part of the world?" "Here. Captain Nasir and trainee Jolt," the pilot said. "The others are dead? And about you?" The voice stuttered something, and then, very quickly, "Quartermaster Raoul to your orders, Captain. I'm with Otrel, the geologist. He looks completely insane. I had to tie him up. Others survived. Unless there's a guy stuck in the left airlock, but I wouldn't be surprised." "The commander?" asked Nasir. "All he has left. Disarticulated." The voice was grating on certain words and exhibited uncalled-for optimism. Nasir said nothing. "Are you hurt, Raoul?" "No, Captain, just a few bruises. But I think Otrel has a broken leg. His knee is bent backward. And you?" "Jolt sprained his wrist, I think. And I'm fine. Tell me, Raoul, and the command pod." "It's a mess. The instruments, scrap metal. I had to work my fingers to the bone to find scraps to fix Tinter, but it's not going to go anywhere." "External inputs." "The what?" "Oh, yes? Well, I can't tell you anything about those. They're on the other side of a blocked door. Tell me, Captain, where are we?" Nasir took a quick look at the intern. "No idea, old man. I just know that we're in some weird pickle. Do you have anything to drink and eat?" The response was a bit delayed. "Well, if I want to." "I restocked at the clinic. Maltose in granule form for solids. 95 alcohol for liquid. This is d'ailleurs why that—" "You stuttered," Nasir cut in. Yes. It was difficult to be stern under the circumstances. "Nevertheless," Nasir ordered. "Stop right there, Raoul. Haven't you got anything else to drink?" Yes, Captain. Plasma. But it's too salty. Oh no." The intercom crackled, and we heard a cry. Then the voice of the chief petty officer, faintly. "Sorry, Captain, but it's my mad one who is pulling the wires with her teeth. I don't know if—" The sound died out suddenly. Nasir turned to Jolt. "What?" "I still had so many things to ask him," he said. "By combining his information with ours, we could make a map of the device's internal damage and act accordingly. There might be a way to contact them without plunging into the fuel." "He has already repaired Tinter once," Jolt said. "Once he neutralizes Otrel, he'll do it again." Nasir approached the opening leading to the gangway. He stayed for a moment, leaning forward, pensive. Then he knelt down to go down. Jolt was surprised. "You're leaving me alone, Captain." "Stay there," the pilot said. "Someone needs to stay near Tinter. In the meantime, I'm going to choose an airtight cabin and gather all the bodies in it." He went down the corridor like a well and opened a door. 2 corpses were mangled with their bones and flesh, intertwined with nameless scrap metal. Monsieur dragged them to the door and tossed them out of the cabin. They fell to the bottom, joining 3 other bodies. The angle of the gangway made this macabre roadway easier to navigate. Monsieur moved on to another room and found it empty. He continued his exploration. A quarter to an hour later, he had launched 9 companions at the rear of the rocket. He stepped out and, choosing to forego turning the tail compartment into a mortuary, picked a side berth for this purpose. He shoved the bodies in one after the other. Some faces were recognizable. Mentally, Monsieur apologized to the dead. His imagination created a dialogue with each of them. "Hey, old buddy, I have to throw you in there. Don't be mad at me, I hope." "I understand, Captain. And are you the sailor, Poco, or are you Rams?" "The chemist." "I'm Rams. See my rank on my sleeve. Forgive me." "Rams, I have to put you with the others. I liked you a lot, but you're dead." For his friend Fatto he showed even more consideration. He went to fetch him last, and, refraining from throwing him down the ladder, slowly let him down on his shoulder with great effort. He laid him down at the bottom and bent over him. He put his hand on his cold cheek in a caress which he would have found ridiculous while the sailor was alive. "Goodbye, Fatto," he said in a whisper. The final pain had strangely frozen a rictus on the features of the dead man. Nasir thought he discerned a tender ridicule in them. A fake irritation made him recover his fellow's argot. "You're making fun of me and my sentimentality," he muttered. "You're taking advantage of the situation, aren't you?" "If I were alive, I'd send you a brown for that." He raised his fist and, very gently, gave an affectionate tap on the lean shoulder. Fearing embarrassment, he looked up to survey the door frame from where Jolt could have seen him. Reassured, he leaned down for a quick kiss on Fatto's forehead. Then he tossed him over the others and shut the door, chewing a ball of bitterness. In the afterlife, the traveler must have twisted with laughter. Monsieur smiled back at him. He looked at the closed door and thought, "You're wrong, my friend. I can tell you we don't have many chances of getting out of this. If I join you soon where you are, you can prepare for a serious explanation. Ask the gods to set up a ring and train." Monsieur scratched his cheek. "Otro may have rendered Tinter useless," he said. "I don't think he could have done much more than rip a few wires out," said Raoul. "From what I heard, he was tied up." Monsieur looked around vaguely. "About an hour ago," he said, "you heard screams." "Where were you?" "In the kitchen," said Raoul. "Or rather, just above it, in the storage room. It's right at the top. It is not possible to go any further. I condemn the dining hall." "Stay here," said Monsieur. "I'll call them." It was damned if he wasn't going to be able to make himself understood by them. He came out and climbed up into the kitchen. Avoiding the garbage slurry disgorged from the crusher, he went into the larder and applied his ear to the last door. All was silent. "Hey!" he shouted. He shouted several times without getting a response. He picked up a tin can and hit the metal of the partition, still to no avail. He threw the can and went back to find Jolt. "I'm going in," he said as he opened a diving helmet cabinet. Jolt didn't dare to protest. Monsieur undressed, keeping only a pair of boxer shorts. To get his limbs into the heavy articulated suit, he got help from the trainee and finally screwed on his helmet while his companion checked the magnetic attraction of thieves. "Joints." "Follow me," he said. "You'll have to close up behind me." When the last door slammed on him, it suddenly got very cold in his suit, and he turned on the auto heat. With a heavy sigh, he made his way across the dining hall, using the tables and chairs that were bolted to the floor. He reached the opposite door, and balancing himself on the back of the last bench, rested his helmed head against the metal flap. The helmet, an acoustic chamber, captured the echoes of sloshing liquids. Mercier held his flashlight beam in front of him as he pondered. The rocket had turned around. The fuel therefore had to weigh directly on the door. Opening it was to receive a heavy wave which would send him rolling on the other side. He spotted the side doors and chose the right one, approaching it, following a row of seats. This door opened onto a small staircase leading to the officers' mess. He knew that. He listened, and finding nothing to worry about, turned the steering wheel to close it. He found the staircase. In normal conditions, one would go up, but the position of the rocket had reversed its use. Mercier went down by placing his heels on the risers rather than the treads of the steps. At the bottom, the door of the mess was still open. He was about to reach her when everything around him started to vibrate as if from an earthquake. A creaking of torn steel, twisted by unknown pressures, a rumble of giant boiling, and, with his legs cut off by a torrent of green-tinged liquid, Mercier spun around in the flooded mess without time to grasp the handrail. The glow from his torch swept across impossible details that couldn't be recognized. He felt as if he were being sucked into a vortex. His helmet scraped against a sound surface. He felt himself falling into an abyss. For his fall slowed gradually. He splashed around. There was no doubt that he was still in some sort of liquid element, but his torch only lit up a kind of dirty fog. He believed he was bathing in dishwater and, by turning a knob on his helmet, modified the wavelength of the beam of light. The liquid brightened. He felt himself touched at the bottom of an enormous cave, the floor as soft as a mattress. He rolled down a slight ramp, then, gripping some kind of grass with his fingers, he sat down and raised his eyes. At 20 meters above him, the front half of the rocket appeared to be fixed to the wall. Mercier felt a jolt. Everything had happened so fast that he hadn't had time for a thought. He hadn't realized that he'd gotten out of the craft. On the moment, he thought the rocket was cut in two, but he almost immediately understood that the other half was hiding behind a terrain indentation. He noticed the tear in the shell where he had fallen through. Above, escapees from an invisible opening, air bubbles were rising and dancing towards the cave ceiling. The ceiling was too far away to distinguish any details. Mercier estimated that the cave was at least 50 meters high and 100 wide. As for the length ovalizing all, lost in the fog of liquid, it was impossible to get an idea. How could they have fallen there? Was it the bottom of a lake? The bottom of the sea? And on what world? Mercier lowered his eyes. Herbs, more correctly algae, lazily swayed with the undecided currents. He picked up some, pulled. The elastic ground obeying the tubers swelled slightly under traction, but Mercier had to use all his force to pluck the plants out. Tight and firmly rooted at their bases, they only gave way when a thin layer tore, resembling a peel. No extensions, no roots. But the sublayer was identical to these waddles of damp rags that Mercier had seen through the screen in the tail cabin. From the wound on the floor, hundreds of small mollusks came crawling out, clung to the glove of the helmet, crawled up the arms and legs of the metal suit. Feeling awkward, Mercier got up, but, unbalanced by the density of the liquid, he placed his foot awkwardly in the tier and sank it up to the knee. He felt his soul pierce something with an unpleasant crunch, like warm metal piercing a membrane. A brown liquid rose from the hole, spitting millions of mollusks. The ground gave a jolt, as if a giant rug were being pulled by an unseen hand. Then it rippled. The whole cave distorted in jerks. The depression now holding the rocket in balance flattened out, making way for a pit. Mercier saw the huge machine take a horizontal position, perform several slow rolls, and crash onto him. Fearing that he would be crushed, he made great efforts to free his trapped leg. It came out with a slapping sound, and it was again hell. The great chaos, a violent but soft earthquake that made the narrow universe containing the device and its pilot spin around. Rest. Nasir slowly fell back into the hole where the rocket had nestled. On all fours, he perched upon the hull of the craft. A feeling of relative safety overcame him, and he remained immobile for a moment to collect his wits. An idea that was horrifying had begun to form in his mind, which his reason vehemently refused, but which facts stubbornly insisted on imposing upon him. He lay down on the hull and tilted his head, scanning long scratches at the shredded edges on the floor that climbed to his left. Panels of membrane covered with algae revealed a tangle of broken pipes. Liquid brown rose from these pipes, which he had caused to flow a few moments earlier. Packages of mollusks were accumulating at the openings, in layers growing thicker and thicker, almost as if to plug up the leaks. And gradually, the wounds were clogging up, healing. Unconsciously, in his internal monologue, Nasir was already using the words wounds, scars. And these words inevitably pushed his reasoning towards a logical conclusion. He was in something living. His subconscious had been telling him for a quarter of an hour. Now he knew it. The floor? A skin? Rather a mucous membrane? The algae? Really? The brown liquid? Blood or something similar? The pipe? The cave? A stomach. Why not? It was therefore necessary to replace the word fluid with the word syrup. By jolt it should be understood spasm, and by deformation, muscular contraction. The rocket had been devoured by a monster. In passing, a giant tooth had literally broken the back of the machine, and this one had avenged himself by tearing the digestive mucosae of the beast, thus causing suffering, and no doubt hiccups in his torturer. The idea of a monster all-eater taken with hiccups enlightened the conscious surface of Nasir. Although appalled, the pilot felt a tremendous laugh rising within him, cut short by a new threat. They were 10, 20, 50 of a man's height. Suddenly emerging from the depths, bizarre head ventosa serpents assailed him, glued to the helmet in bottles of kisses. They sought to suck metal, abandoned, began again at a different place. Obstinate face failure. Disgusted, Nasir clung to the rungs of the hull. The inside of the helmet resonated with multiple grotesque embracements. The beasts also attacked the apparatus. They stuck hungrily to the smooth and hard surface, their round mouths flattened like a rubber plug on the obstacle that had to be overcome. Then they drew back frantically at T, full speed. In vain. With a wave of his arm, Nasir tried to push them away, as one would shoo off two familiar birds. But one of them placed her suction cup smack in the middle of the helmet's window, and the pilot was able to contemplate, up close and against his will, the bottom of a rosy-hued throat, animated by voided, hideous peristaltic contractions, sadistically lit by the lamp. He seized a vibrantly muscular neck hole in his fist and pulled the beast away, eliciting a monstrous nurse suckling on the starry window of mucus. Disgust made him crude. "What nasty business," he said aloud, as the animal twisted at his wrist, its eyes rolling strangely, revulsion all over its face. The shattered look in the sides of a greedy lips call had something revolting, obscene about it. Nasir felt as if he were being desired by a band of hysterical harpies. His anger clenched his fingers around the neck of the captive beast. The hideous mouth pursed into a corollary. A fiber-like cloth crackled in the metal fist, while the tail wrapped around the arm of the spacesuit. Nasir climbed step by step, with his eyes closed, under a shower of affectionate and greedy caresses. He had set himself a goal: to tear the hull. But before he reached it, He fell into a sudden cavity that opened beneath his knees. He opened his eyes. He saw himself in the accident-open passageway. He no longer needed to rely on the magnetic closure. Nasir pushed the door and clutched the steering wheel with all his might, imprisoning not only 2 sucking snakes in addition to the corpse he hadn't let go, but also himself. From the glove, he beat on the second door and pounded on the hood of the car to get a response to his calls. In the pre-hallway, Jolt paled. It was frightening to know that one was on an alien planet and to hear knocks at the outer door. The knocks redoubled, followed by soft, flaccid noises like kisses. Jolt applied his ear to the tin. Accusing himself of idiocy, he shouted, "Who's there?" The answer was distant, muted by the screen of metal. "Messiah." Jolt had a moment of shock. He repeated his question. "It's me, monsieur," the voice answered. "I got out through a tear in the hull." "Good heavens," Jolt muttered. Then louder, "Open up." No, don't panic, Jolt. Try the compressor to blow away the liquid." "Liquid, yes. We're at the bottom of who knows what. We're swimming in the stuff." The intern reprimanded a curse and rushed to the controls. He pushed a lever at random and waited a minute. "It doesn't work," he cried. "So what? Close the pre-shutter door and put on a spacesuit. I'm with dangerous animals." Jolt's heart was pounding faster. Very dangerous. In any case, they can't do anything against a spacesuit. The noise of sucking sounds like it's coming from them. Yes, they suck everything they come across. "Okay, I'll get dressed," said Jolt, opening a closet. He put on the heavy boots, metal shorts, corset. He was ready in 20 minutes and opened the door. He was pushed back by a strong pressure and went to collapse in the corner, while Messiah rolled on his feet with wriggling serpents in a boiling liquid. In a second, a green mist transformed the pre-portal into a steam bath. Jolt jerked when Messiah's glove hit him on the shoulder. The pilot pushed his helmet against that of the apprentice. "Well, does it fit? What do you think about that?" Snakes," Jolt the cow said, "yes." "And what about this liquid that evaporates at room temperature? Are you not cold?" "No," said Jolt, chattering her teeth. He turned up his heating. The pilot, on the other hand, was turning down his. "It's less cold than outside," Messiah said. "Chlorine." "What chlorine?" "That green gas." Messiah paused for a moment. He hadn't thought about that. And yet, yes, chlorine did have that very color. Jolt may have been right. That would explain the cold outside the rocket, chlorine freezing at 38, and animals could live in there. Messiah leaned forward. He kicked away with his foot a dying snake, killed by his change of environment. The beast was no longer animated by anything but painful shivers. Messiah rested his helmet on top of the apprentice's. "Where are our heads?" he said. "The intercom in the apparatus is messed up, but not the helmets. Put it in." Jolt obeyed. His voice rang through the pilot's headphones. "If we had thought of it earlier, you could have kept me updated on your crew as events unfolded, Captain." The rocket did the fish jumping. "I wonder how I didn't break into little pieces." "What's happening outside?" Messiah pursed his lips behind his window. He said slowly, "It's worse and more insane than anything you could imagine, Jolt. But first, let's get rid of this chlorine if there is any. It won't be convenient. We don't have anything to hand in the pre-shutter." Messiah looked up and then stood up, feeling around the ceiling. "I think so," he said as he grabbed onto a pipe. He had the rocket's plan in mind, starting to get an idea of the damage and their locations. If he was not mistaken, the water pipe that passed there must have been working. He hung himself by the hands and roared with all his might. The weight of the helmet added to that of the pilot. The pipe slowly twisted, let go in a single blow. A jet of water flooded the cockpit. "But, Captain," Jolt protested, "you're making hydrochloric acid here." "Who cares?" smiled Monsieur under the beneficent rain. "If it's sufficiently diluted, I doubt it will be that bothersome. I know I'm adding to the mess, but we're not that close anymore. And then we'll be able to neutralize it later." To speed up the reaction, he increased the intensity of his lamp by asking Jolt to do the same. The vapors gradually disappeared. They bathed in a yellow-brown liquid. "And the water?" insisted the apprentice. "What are we going to do with the water?" "Let it flow into the pit. I'll turn off the tap when I leave. 70 cubic meters of water spread over 100 square meters is not a disaster. We will see that later." He confessed that he had found a practical way to give us some oxygen. "We are going to enjoy an atmosphere of high mountain." "By the gods!" Jolt exclaimed. "I had completely forgotten this question." Without losing a second, Monsieur jumped on him, grabbed him by the arms, and carried him to the broken pipe shower. The patient struggled like a fine devil with cries cut by hiccups. Monsieur set him back on his feet and gave him a reassuring smile through his helmet. Raoul staggered and went to lean against the partition. He looked at the water that was lapping at his knees. "How?" he muttered. Monsieur had loosened his helmet. The smell hit him in the throat. "Chlorine water," he explained, coughing. "With a good dose of acid, you could have suffered from it, old man. I especially thought about your eyes." "How did you get here?" Raoul, dazed, alternated looking at the pilot and the trainee. "I went through the ventilation duct and past the kitchen," he said. "The way is clear. You scared me, Captain. I thought I was being attacked by a native of this planet." He looked again at the liquid that was dropping sight faster, drank by the lower floors. "Why this water?" Then, noticing the spacesuits, "You've been out." "The rocket is in liquid chlorine." Koopa took off his helmet as he finished. "I'll explain everything later." Jolt isn't much better informed either. I went out alone. On the other hand, the apprentice was taking off his boots while coughing to break wind. The liquid had completely disappeared. The punctured piping sprayed the smooth floor. Nasir opened a waterproof cabinet and put on a suit. He then went out into the courtyard and turned off a tap. "I'm glad the machine is horizontal," he said. "Let's hope it lasts." The other two followed him. "What's that?" Raoul shrieked, convulsed before a snake. "It's dead. Don't be afraid. But don't touch with your bare hands. One doesn't know what it is made of." He went into a cabin, tore off a sheet and the new beast in the cloth. "I'll have to examine that, Jolt." "Well, what are you doing?" The intern was scraping the empty boots of Monsieur with a knife. He was collecting something in his handkerchief. "Shellfish," he said. "And then this." He held up his open handkerchief, disgusted. Nasir approached and said, "A fragment of digestive mucus." "How?" Nasir shook his head. "Right away, I'll tell you. Keep it close." He turned to the sergeant. "Are you no longer drunk, Raoul?" "No, Captain. All these tales would even dispel a delirium tremens. You don't seem to have suffered from the apparatus's exercises," smiled Monsieur. "It's because there is a God for drunks, Captain. I clung on as best I could. What have you done to Autrel?" Raoul's face tight. "He died, crushed by the fall of an electro-cabinet." Monsieur sighed. "Lead us forward, Raoul. I want to see this a bit closer." The three men set off, all while following the quartermaster. Monsieur was talking to Jolt. "In principle, the front of the rocket is more solid than the back, and we will have at our disposal all the equipment with some chance to repair them." I think you're right, Captain," said Raoul. "But there's one essential thing missing in the front. Food." We'll transport as many canned foods as possible through the ventilation duct. Also, piece by piece. All the helmets. I fear that in time the rocket will split into 2 pieces. They entered the kitchen. Raoul showed them the orifice of the pipe under the metal ladder leading to the holding room. They slipped in one after another and crawled forward. Suddenly the rocket tilted slightly to one side. One could hear the skids of debris. The conduct twisted little by little. "Quick!" shouted Monsieur. "Faster! Let's get out of here!" Following Raoul, he passed an elbow from the conduct, whose angle was accentuating in the blink of an eye. On all fours, the apprentice rushed behind him. Raoul and Monsieur jumped into the relaxation room and turned back to help Joel. This one, with a wrinkled face from the effort, extended his hands to the other two, saying, "Caught by the neck." They took him by the wrists and dragged him. The apprentice was very likely to be broken in half by the torsion of the conduit. They ripped him roughly from his dangerous position, and all 3 rolled into a tangle at the other end of the hall. Jolt shuddered with a huge cry as the roar of crumpled metal echoed through the whole rocket. The room tilted forward at an oblique angle. Raoul was first to recover, exclaiming, "I feel like the food route is blocked." Monsieur remained leaned over the unconscious trainee. He felt his knees and then his legs. "Broken ankles," he said. "Help me carry it." But the quartermaster remained immobile, shoulders hunched, head bowed towards the ground. "So what now, Raoul?" said Monsieur. Raoul had a sort of sob. "We'll never get out of this, Captain. Never, never, I'd rather." In one bound, Monsieur was on him and gave him a mighty slap that sent him reeling. Then he lifted him up by his spacesuit collar and held him in front of himself. "Ensign," he said in a harsh voice. "I don't usually punch my men, and besides, such violence is against regulations. Consider this as if I hadn't punched you." My action was therapeutic, preventive against a nervous breakdown. "Got it?" the other stuttered. Sa joue virait au rouge, ses yeux coulaient des larmes. "Vous m'avez compris?" répéta le pilote. "Oui, capitaine," souffla Raoul, Massy relâche. "À chaque crise de nerfs ou accès de pessimisme de votre part, je me ferai dans l'obligation de vous appliquer la même thérapeutique." Il se pencha vers le stagiaire inerte. "Veuillez m'aider, Raoul." They laid the intern out on a table at the clinic. After securing his lamp to the ceiling with duct tape, Monsieur rifled through several cabinets and finally unearthed a box of ionophoresis, similar to the one that had sewn his ribs back together. He examined the electrodes and, recalling the details of the treatment, didn't hesitate too much in anesthetizing the injured man's legs. This is the translation of the provided text from Otto to N. As he woke up, Monsieur smiled at him. "Admit that I'm not so bad at this," he said. Joel returned his smile. "You're a very talented captain." "Aren't I?" asked Raoul. "I also nursed him back to health. With success." "With success? Ah?" The quartermaster looked embarrassed. "Has something broken?" "Well, Raoul," Monsieur said with a smile, "don't look so glum, old fellow." Raoul addressed the doctor. "My morale has collapsed." The captain straightened it up with a splendid hammer, he said as he rubbed his cheek. "I felt like I was waltzing in an unknown constellation." "Be careful," Monsieur interrupted. "There are taboo subjects." The laugh of the apprentice made a diversion. "The captain was gentler to me. He gave me pills, preferential treatment," reproached the quartermaster. "Say now, you two," said Monsieur. "This is the last salon where they talk here." Jolt, if you told me what to do now. The apprentice looked at his swollen ankles. "Radio essential, Captain." "Is it urgent?" "No. So long as I don't have any more pain. Can I leave the electrodes in place? Yes, why not? Because despite your case being interesting, we have a ton of very urgent things to do. My ankles can wait a few hours. Okay, said Monsieur as he unwound the wires and placed the box within reach of the doctor. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. Raoul, pass me the straps. He tightened as many belts around the shoulders and waist of the apprentice as he could. Then he used a lot of adhesive tape to attach the box to the table. We'll leave you alone for a while, he explained. If the rocket still needs to do the pas de bourreau tied up like you are, you won't be in any danger. You've got the easy part. Rest and recover while we work. By the way, what did you do with your handkerchief and the samples it contains? In my pocket, said Jolt. Monsieur grabbed it and shoved them into a drawer. Suddenly, he collapsed onto a chair. It's my turn to fall apart, he said. I'm exhausted. Jolt pointed to a cabinet. Raoul said, in the top locker, you'll find blue bottles marked RX. Make a general distribution. It's my turn. We all need a doping. Each person emptied their bottle. After a few minutes, a new vigor filled them. A question burned on Jolt's lips. Captain, he said, what's happening outside? Fantastic, said Monsieur. But I don't have time to say more. Time is running out. He looked at the shelves. Are there any lamps here? He asked. Maybe, said another voice. In this drawer. The pilot found what he was looking for and fixed a new lamp to his forehead. He dragged Raoul inside. See you later, he told the wounded man. After a 10-hour marathon, the two men were doped up. They enforced the wearing of helmets and straps always ready to latch onto anywhere. But the rocket stayed still. They stuffed all the accessible corpses into an airtight cabin. They verified and brought online a backup system to purify the atmosphere, shut watertight doors on compartments dangerous or unsafe, tripped the ties of all mobile objects that might move. They then, armed with a tool suitable for this type of work, expanded the air duct bent towards the kitchen with a hand crank and hurried to stock as much food and drink as possible in the front part of the rocket. Monsieur almost forgot something, but he remembered at the last moment to report a sucking snake in front for examination. Finally, condemning the last outcome, they welded a thick metal panel over the opening of the duct. I feel more relaxed, said Monsieur, rubbing his hands. Let's go see Jolt. This one welcomed them with joy. He was very bored. His ankles were radiographed. The fractures were less severe than they could have been. For a half hour, the intern guided the care being given to him. When it was over, Raoul and Monsieur chose two cots and lay down on them. They slung several safety belts around their bodies. There was a period of silence. Then, calmly, Masser told all that he knew. He chose cold, colorless words. His story was dreary as a report, but he felt the anxiety chill his companions as he spoke. Strange to say, though, the enormity of this anxiety had an anesthetic quality. The implausibility of the facts surpassed the imagination, like a shot too long missing the target. And fear was there, black and massive, yet rendered impotent by its own excess. The hearts of the survivors beat no faster. There was only one response: silence. A silence as black and vast as fear, as still as it. Monsieur spoke again, shortly, gathering its mass on specific points. Fear could invent secret tortures, tighten throats, twist nerves, whip up images of panic. It was necessary to take the lead, inject a serum into the moral of his companions, prevent a crisis, with words. Finally he said, "We have taken care of business. We are in the most stable and solid part of the rocket. I have a surprise for this monster. Let's sleep." The lamps went out one by one. Monsieur closed his eyes. It will be day tomorrow, he thought. But no, it would not be day. And the word tomorrow had lost all meaning. Weakened by distance, whispers of kisses flooded the hull with repulsive tenderness. Monsieur fell asleep, lulled by an imperceptible roll. Part 2. One Jolt and Raoul were working in the laboratory. Monsieur was alone in the radio cabin. The replacement of a silicon crystal and 3 rafted wires had restored contact. Monsieur had heard the voices of men faint and cut by parasites. This voice said, "Considered lost. F-1313. Lost searches abandoned. 1313. F-1313. Abandoned. The last link had broken. Monsieur felt lonely. Lonelier even than his companions, to whom he would hide the truth, carrying on his shoulders the whole weight of a cruel certainty. He sighed, checked the battery series that ensured the operation of the device, and with a push set the endless thread where his call was recorded. F-1313. Accident impossible to specify position instruments out of use 3 survivors. F-1313 accident. Ridiculous and fragile, these small sentences of phrases flew on the airwaves, sought their way in cosmic storms, bounced off dead asters into populated planets inhabited by deaf monsters, with a small, tiny chance of making the metal eardrum of a receiver vibrate. So the shipwreck cast their bottles into the sea in bygone days. Bottles found 2 or 3 centuries later, or not at all. He cast one last glance at the crossbeams and the strap-locks securing the apparatus. Then he went to find the others. Jolt exulted. He pointed to the screen of the analysynthesizer. "What do you think, Captain?" "Don't know," said Monsieur. The screen was bright and showed an inconceivable mess of chemical formulas linked by chains of extreme complexity. Raoul had a respectful and bewildered air. He could not believe that he had been useful in this area. "Congratulate Raoul," said the apprentice. He restored a good part of the Ansin. "Oh, you know," the confused quartermaster apologized. "A transfo is a transfo and a wire is a wire. I fixed it without understanding anything." "But it works," Jolt said vibrantly. Monsieur coughed. "What does that lead to?" "Fantastical." The apprentice roared. "A life based on chlorine and silicon." Monsieur smiled discreetly. The doctor's good mood was pleasant to see. The passion for discovery had swept away his concern. "This is hemoglobin," Jolt declared, pointing to the screen. "What?" Monsieur was neither a chemist nor a doctor, but a formula laden with C3H and chloris put paid to his vague notions of biology. Jolt burst out laughing. "Captain, please understand me. I left from the assumption that this brown liquid smearing on the mucus was blood of this monster. I have isolated an extremely complex body, as you can see. But if you do not hypnotize yourself on these couples of silicic acid, if you replace them in your imagination by a simple line, you will find a striking identity of structure with a polyporlic compound, such as theme or chlorophyll. This is, if I dare say, a respiratory pigment corresponding to our hemoglobin, but where palladium takes the place of iron and silica that of carbon. "Stop," said the pilot, plugging his ears. "You're going to drive me completely crazy. Respiratory pigment, do you say? What does it breathe?" "Chlorine, just chlorine." "Just chlorine," replied Monsieur sarcastically. "Liquid chlorine. On top of that, What will we do with this beautiful discovery? A lot of things. Exploded Jolt. If we find a body to form a stable compound with this pigment, we can kill the monster by progressive asphyxiation. I succeed in forming a tricyclic core and a piperidine cycle based on morphine. I'll go for it. It seems to me that you're rushing a bit, Monsieur cut in. It's already extraordinary that this pigment is roughly modeled on hemoglobin. You deduce an entire metabolism from it. Are you not building on clouds? I found other analogies. I've noticed disturbing pseudopeptide chains in sucking snakes. My instinct tells me to try making. Stop. This is the translation of the text into English. Where will you find the necessary components, Monsieur? If you plan to sacrifice the transistors of the rocket for silicon, I object. I warn you. Jolt laughed. But no, Captain. What are you looking for there? We have everything we need. It won't be hard to use the sucking snakes as raw material, since their metabolism is the same as that of the monster. I'll pound them up in Tan-Sin's mixer. It's not made for industrial production. It will get hot. Of course, it's tough work. But Raoul has put additional circuit breakers in place. The chief quartermaster interrupted the conversation. Say, Doc, what now? Demanded Jolt. I had... Could you make a worming tonic? Worming tonic? Yes, those kind of serpent things. That's all look like monster parasites to me. Reptiles. Jolt smiled at Monsieur in amusement. We'll think about it, he said. The pilot returned to more serious concerns. Something is missing. To act on this monster with your methods, you need to know its anatomy and dimensions. Jolt raised a finger in the air. I thought so, he said. We'll have to suit up and carry out a series of dangerous explorations of this gigantic body, full of traps and seizures of seismic violence. I must admit that it doesn't tell me anything at all. I've been there before. Without answering, Jolt stood up and opened a cabinet. He pulled out a lead-lined can and handed it to the pilot. This one raised an eyebrow in a questioning manner. I thought about that, the intern repeated. That vat contains lead sulfide. So what? The sulfur in that sulfide is tagged. It's radioactive sulfur. It'll need to be injected into one of the monster's vessels. It'll travel through the whole circulatory network, and I imagine will then slowly spread throughout the interstitial liquids. You will be able to follow his journey on out. A series of different recording screens. The tracer will gradually draw us the general contours of the animal. Why of molybdenum sulfide? Because this monster's circulatory plasma, if I dare say, is very rich in it. Because sulfur is one of the main constituents of pseudopeptide chains, which I mentioned earlier. It replaces oxygen. They stayed silent for a moment, soon broken by the quartermaster. I admit that I don't understand any of this, he said timidly. If I were alone, I would certainly know what to do. I'd put on a spacesuit and try to get out of this mess through the mouth, or... Come on, Raoul. Monsieur laughed. Don't be rude. Besides, nothing tells us that this monster has a mouth. We're in a complete mystery. It had to have gotten into the rocket somehow, Raoul protested. It may have taken the rocket for a suppository. Or a pill, said Jolt, laughing. There is another possibility, said Monsieur. We may have penetrated into him at a mad rate, like a fireball. If so, Raoul suddenly interrupted himself, his eyes getting wider. Said the pilot. We may have killed him, whispered the chief petty officer. The tremors the other day were perhaps agonizing spasms. Have you noticed that he hasn't moved in at least 60 hours? We would be delighted, but... "No," said Monsieur with force. His two companions looked at him in amazement at his brutal interruption. "No," repeated the pilot. "I see no reason to wish for the monster's death." I don't understand, Captain." "Let me explain. We would have the greatest difficulty in getting the rocket out of a gigantic corpse, buried under whatever depth of liquid chlorine. A few hours ago I went out without telling you to check the case of the apparatus. It is intact. At least it has not suffered additional damage, so it can't be digested by the monster." "I don't know what you're getting at," said the apprentice. "But I warn you, Captain, I don't have the certainty yet that we're in an active part of the digestive tube." "Yes," said Monsieur. "I've seen with my own eyes half-digested snake corpses. These snakes aren't parasites of the monster, but prey. They lived in the chlorine as long as the monster didn't release digestive juices. You went out?" Raoul was surprised. Monsieur says, "I fixed the front left door. But I'll come back to my point. If the rocket isn't digestible, it's a foreign body that the organism will try to eliminate in some way. By regurgitation, perhaps. In any case, we can expect a lot from the life of this monster and its reflexes. If he has swallowed us by mistake, let him expect to spit us out again." "I think you're right," said Jolt after a moment's thought. "That's not all," went on the pilot. "Do you know what the temperature is outside? It's -15, and the chlorine is liquid. Since chlorine boils at 38 below zero, that shows we are under an extraordinary pressure. Probabilmente sotto chilometri, sul fondo di un mare. E se la gravità di questo pianeta non dire sciocchezze, interruppe Massia, camminiamo con la stessa. Facilità c'è sulla Terra. Le nostre sensazioni sostituiscono approssimativamente gli strumenti di misura fuori uso. Sentisco anche una piccola sensazione di leggerezza. Jolt gli gettò un pezzo di carta per iscriversi qualche cifra. He murmured, "Let's assume that gravity is the same as on Earth. It will be easy for us to calculate the depth." "But no," said Monsieur. "Don't waste your time with that. Your ignorance of the exact gravity will all be wrong. And besides, you ignore the atomic mass of this chlorine. Do you think it would be an isotope?" "I don't think anything," said the pilot, "but everything is possible. Everything. We are hosted by a living organism. A temperature of -15 is tolerated in the stomach. Outside, it may be -50. There's more. It's hard to estimate whether the rocket should float in chlorine gas, given its state, but I think the suits would. I sank faster than if I had been in the water. You see that one can rely on no recognized notions." Monsieur considered his companions. The dirty light of the lamp and the reflection of the bright screen cut out bumps on their faces. Their dark circles, their fledgling beards, and their wrinkled suits were starting to turn them into beggars. The mandatory wearing of helmets added a grotesque note to their appearance. "As soon as we have a minute," thought the pilot, "I'll make them shave and change clothes." Morale suffers from these negligences. He ran his hand over his chin and felt a bristle of stiff hairs. "He should." "We know too little," said Joel. "You made me realize our impotence." "Don't say that, Monsieur. I put your eyes in the face of the holes. I showed you dead ends and useless searches to undertake. This must bring you back to the only reasonable path. You started very well," Jolt said, pointing to Ensign. "Keep going this way. When we know more about the beast, we can act. I have some ideas in mind on this matter." The chief petty officer coughed to clear his throat and asked, "Do you think it's dead, that monster?" "No," said the pilot. "Maybe it's just sleeping. If it were dead, the temperature would have dropped. In my opinion, it's digesting its snakes." Outside, the ground was covered in a thick layer of animal decomposition matter. It was quite disgusting. Slowly, very slowly, the rocket tilted to the right, then returned to its first position, passing it swaying to the left, like a ship rocked by almost imperceptible roll. The three men hastily attached their harnesses to the handrails. Jolt turned off the power. They stared at each other, worried. But the pendular movement seemed to go on forever. "Let's not fall asleep," said Messire. "Keep working as if nothing happened." Without a word, Jolt opened a cabinet and pulled out the dissected corpse of the leech serpent. He spread it out on a table and started to adjust a microscope. Nasir had a satisfied smirk and exited the room. He strolled down the corridor, making sure to secure his safety by unclipping his belt loops from the handrails along the way. At every turn, he would switch which rail they were clipped onto. A minor but necessary time loss against the effects of an unexpected spasm. The monster had ripped itself from the abyssal vases. He was swimming in the open sea, with a free and flexible movement, almost without moving the scaly fins that bordered his sides like the rows of oars of a trireme. A continuous wave lowered the fins one by one, then ran to the tail, propelling the long body through the cold night with a regular stroke. The monster had learned to avoid movements that stirred up a cruel inn. He had given up the frantic convulsions that, far from soothing his suffering, exalted it to an unbearable paroxysm. He lived as an invalid, at a slow pace, but his gurgling brain established no connection between his ailments and the shiny, smooth prey he had devoured. His mouth shut, and with no appetite, he passed a bank of suckers, knocking them over as a ball knocks down pins in a game. Stupid. 4 or 5 snakes stuck to his camel-like head. He calmly increased his speed, and the force of the current tore them away. The coolness and long caress of liquid chlorine animated his sides with a shiver of pleasure. He forced the lure, taking advantage of the last autumn currents still spared by the cold. A terrible cold that would soon freeze the entire planet into a block of tormented rocks. A general feeling of weakness told him to seek less dense areas. Gradually he climbed up. Spread out by the pressure change, his body swelled like a balloon. He soon rose to the boiling surface of the ocean, emerged from the atmospheric mist. A living curse on the scale of densities, he flew like a Ludian at the indecisive and fluctuating liquid-gas frontier. On his back, a long spine stood up, stretching as a sail the permeable and highly vascularized membrane that served him as gills, because its organism could only catalyze relaxed chlorine, with very loose molecules. The liquid of the depths was nothing but a playground and a hunting ground, not a fluid fuel. And like a whale, the monster had to rise to the surface at least once a season to breathe, to inflate its reserves of extremely complex and unstable chlorids. However, she was able to perceive colors, outlines, and distances with special organs. Long hair antennas and radar screens played continuous emissions that stroked the relief of carbon islands and the quality of light nimbusing the beaches from a distance. And even with the hearing augmented by sight, men's rudimentary vision would have paled next to such a powerful, refined, and rich in detail sense. Blowing on the powerful rhythm of waves pounding against cliffs, each grain of sand added its personal touch to the choruses of bubbling bubbles, the iridescent sprays of bubbling bubbles, swells, the long wires and glissandos of currents. Sound and color meant nothing, or almost nothing. The hues sang, the dazzling noises danced a brilliant dance in the head of the monster. With an organ similar to this, a man, at a single glance at the moving tuft of an exposed tree, would have distinguished the reflection of each leaf and its personal song, the break of even the smallest twig, the minute detail of the creak of wood under multiple twists, the tactile hardness of the bark and the spongy softness of the heartwood, the slow flow of sap, and countless subtle dissonances in tone, image, and scent, spices of a majestic symphony attacking all senses, all nerves, all paresthesias at once. An individual would have derived invaluable benefits from it, both noble and sensual. But the monster, with a barely conscious soul, its senses blunted, felt only a vague sense of physical comfort. It devoured glory with the complacency of a pig wallowing in pearls. Repelled by gaseous chlorine, its respiratory pigment, through the action of an increased molecular mass acting on certain centers, it caused a gradual lowering of its dorsal membrane. Then, disturbed by internal combustion activities, the monster sought the delightful freshness of the deep waters. He slowly dived, left the fizzing layer on the surface, sunk into a pool of shimmering reflections, lost himself in the night, emerged lower and lower, accompanied by dancing. Bubbles ripped one by one from the heavy caress of the depths. From his gloves, Jolt felt the digestive mucosa. He felt the long tube vibrate in his hands like a snake under a blanket. He signaled to his companions. "I found a boat," he said. Messire advanced, the giant syringe on his shoulder. He slowly directed the hollow point toward the spot indicated by the trainee. Jolt guided the penetration of metal. Slowly, the point disappeared into the flesh. "Am I going?" asked Raoul. At the signal from Jolt, the master-at-arms placed behind Messire pressed the piston. 30 liters of lead sulfide gradually mixed with the beast's plasma. When the syringe was empty, the three men looked at each other. A smile relaxed Raoul's weary features behind his window. Messire had a glistening face, dripping with sweat, caressed by the oscillating shadow of his interior wiper blade. A fever lighted up Jolt's hollow eyes. The intern placed his hands on either side of the needle. The other two took a few steps back. The point re-emerged, gleaming. "Hurry up," said Messire. One after another, they returned to the hatch, clumsy and stumbling. The door slammed shut on them. No sooner had they undressed of their helmets than they rushed to the screens. Guided by the radiosulfur, tracers had begun to trace out the giant circulatory system. An extraordinary anatomy was slowly taking shape before the three men's bewildered eyes. "It works!" exclaimed Jolt in a vibrating and repressed voice. Sulfur formed an oily stain on loose cloth filled with capillaries, and then it rose up the trunk of a large veined branch that was branching out rapidly. It seemed like the plant's growth had accelerated. Soon the main screen displayed the bright image of a fish afflicted with goiter and a gigantic, undulating tail. Messire turned to look at the apprentice with surprise. "But the image is moving," he said incredulously. "Of course, Captain, the tracer deposits a layer of ions on the screen. These ions fluctuate directly under the influence of moving radiosulfur. I believe we can refine the system. See, the light is blue. I will tackle the task and find a way to vary the shades according to the fabrics. We will fix silicates in the skeleton and sulfates in the muscular cells. We will thus have a polychrome image." "What is?" said the chief mate, pointing his finger at a dark spot. "The rocket!" exclaimed Jolt. "The rocket makes a screen. By God, look at that, Captain. We are stuck in the middle of this goiter. The beast holds its stomach like a bag attached under its chin. But see, the esophagus makes a curve backward. It is relatively narrow. This explains the inability where the monster can spit us out. I wonder even how it could swallow us." A very fine network of intertwined lines clearly outlined the smallest organs of the monster. The curvature of his esophagus was similar to a spiral metal pipe. "I don't understand," said Raoul. "If the use stops radiation from passing through, then the screens shouldn't be working." "Jolt has already explained that to you earlier," grumbled Messire. "The primary screens are plastered over the stomach like posters. They're not in the rocket. Only the secondary ones are inside, and the wavelength is changed from one to another." "Yeah." The chief petty officer grumbled unconvincingly. "But there's something else I don't understand. Where we are placed, we should only have an oblique view. I told you earlier that the secondary main was summarizing all of the angles from the others. "Damn," said Raoul, after a moment of silence. "I didn't know you were so well informed." In the middle of the image, a monstrous heart beat at long intervals. Plus heart. A fine mesh showed connections with the heart and characteristics, such as Jolt did not miss. It was a lung. The intern was astonished at its dimensions. He still did not know the role of reservoir of this organ. When he was satiated with the spectacle, Massier let out a big sigh of impatience. "Let's talk well," he said. This experiment is fascinating. I don't argue with that. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we need to get out of this mess. So it is some kind of fish." "I was afraid of that." "My little Jolt, you're going to make me turn this marvel into an amphibian or reptile." "How?" the doctor exclaimed. "You must be able to do that," insisted Massier. "You've already given us proof of your abilities. You will push the study of the monster a bit. When you know enough, you will gradually change its metabolism to force it to climb onto dry land, if I dare say. I hope continents emerge from this sea of chlorine." Jolt had slumped his shoulders. He looked crushed by the pilot's confidence. He stammered. "You mean I have to grow him legs?" "Grow him wings, if you like. Wheels or hooves. I see no harm in it as long as he gets back into the atmosphere. We have no chance down here. Once we surface, we'll be able to see more clearly. At that time, I won't hesitate to sacrifice the beast to get out. I suppose this won't be too difficult. When I've got both feet on solid ground, your job will be done. You'll have nothing but our little vitamin shortages to worry about. As for me, I can start thinking about takeoff. I'm definitely set on dying on Earth, not out in some forgotten corner. What do you say?" Jolt gave a pale smile and shrugged his shoulders. "I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it," he said finally. "I think that if, under these circumstances, and by virtue of my trade, I am the brain, you, Captain, are the will. It would still take the will not to tire out the brain. You ask me for something incredible. Mutations take place, and rarely from one generation to another. You demand the metamorphosis of an organism at completed ontogeny. First, we know nothing about that. This kind of tadpole can become a frog. In this case, you'll just have to speed up things. Second, biologist Powelton has successfully achieved the metamorphosis of a fully grown carp into a kind of crocodile, thus jumping at least one phylogenetic stage. It is true that this artificial crocodile was asexed, but I don't care much about the sequel of the monster who swallowed us. What was Powelton's method?" The intern hesitated. "I found out," he said slowly. "He left from the principle that each individual living long enough would pursue an evolution in principle completed. That a monkey living for thousands of years would inevitably become a man without being forced to pass the torch on to successive generations. A man or something else?" "Certainly. Don't go into details." And then, from a practical point of view, mouth agape, the crew chief drank in Jolt's words. He used the conditional, said this one. "Every monkey would become a man if his life were prolonged, and if his physiologic state were maintained at a relatively young age. What do you call a young age? For humans, 15 years. For carp, 18 months. But for this monster, in action expressing all kinds of incertitudes." "Well," said Monsieur, "you have told us the conditions under which the method was to be applied. But what about the method itself?" Lost in thought, the intern seemed to awaken from a dream. "What now?" "The method," repeated the pilot. "Ah, yes." Powelton had applied a minuscule and spaced-out treatment of perichlorophenol mutagenesis. He completed it with gamma-ray applications on the glands with internal secretion. Go ahead, Jolt. Cut, Messier. Make us a hexacarbon cycle. Hexasilicoxalic, corrected the apprentice. There might be something to make a traditional chemist jump. I wonder if it's possible. I only have rudimentary knowledge of chemistry, you know. It's possible, the pilot affirmed. Give us a hexa, machine cycle. I'll handle the gamma rays. With Tan-Sin, we can do miracles. I'll try, but it will take months. We can hold out for 2 years in the rocket. The quartermaster turned around, coughed to clear his throat, and said, Captain, he asked in a respectful tone, do you mean to say that we are going to run this fish like a rabbit? Like a zebra? Thundered Messier. 3 when the thaw came. Confused sensations gradually roused the monster from its winter torpor. Long, broken cries from the ice shelf of chlorine, splashing of a new light on. The cliffs of the islands, gradual cooling of the surface where eager, hungry suckers were already frothing. A wave of muscle ran restlessly through its captive tail, confined by a solid gang. His heart raced. His fins yearned for freedom. Slowly, his many efforts produced a fatal heat to the crystals surrounding him. He soon transformed into a giant tank with enlarged dimensions. A few hours of perseverance opened a path to the upper levels. He cleared the last obstacles and splashed in the liquid. All was joy as he strode straight ahead, covering kilometers, before being suddenly assailed by an odd fatigue. He choked and frantically spread his respiratory membrane. He went higher, struggling against his weakness, emerged in half-consciousness, and let himself be carried by the waves. He lived a long time in torment, sometimes barely noticeable, and half disguised as pleasure, sometimes acute. An unusual force shaped his body, worked on his smallest organs, softened his skeleton to stretch it here, tie it there, forging a new being. Thirsty for gas, its membrane folded into 1,000 horn-like convolutions that kept it rigid like a crest. The sun was rising, and the pustules that had been burning his skin lubrified it as he lost weight from fasting and spending so much time outside of the water. His fins, which had previously been drowned by the thickness of his sides, no importance. Stretched out by the unconscious effort it put forth to maintain its balance, they stretched out to either side like a seesaw, hardening of muscles clumped around bony arches. Built at breakneck speed by silica-carrying plasma, the monster felt thirsty, a sensation unknown to it until now. It opened its soft mouth, and but tons of liquid that, by the labyrinths of its anatomy, renewed the freshness of its internal environment, gradually eliminated toxins and iron, waste products produced by its metamorphosis. Exhausted, he fell asleep while nature finished up the last touches, pigmenting his limp skin gold and blue. It floated like a ship, gently rolled by the currents towards the shores. Is he not dead? Raoul wondered. You can see that the heart is still beating, Jolt said. That may not mean much, Messier hesitated. When I was a kid, I used to make frogs' hearts flutter in a glass of salt water. Rest assured, Captain, Jolt continued, I don't think that nature, aided by our practices, it's true, has devoted so much effort to this metamorphosis to end up foolishly with death. Messier showed the horizontal screen. I'm not a biologist, he declared, but dynamism knows me. I'll hang if it works like that. His finger stretched towards the 6 members of the beast. He clarified, its legs are much too short, and if you examine the muscle ratios to the skeleton, you'll see that they make very leverage. Plus, his belly will drag on the ground. It's a bastard we've made there, neither aquatic nor, and seals, Jolt interrupted. What seals? They are much less badly built than this horror. But after all, the main thing is that he drags a bit on the mainland and spits us at him. I hope you will know how to make it spit, Jolt. Let's say vomit. You ask me a lot, Captain. And we still don't know if he will deign to come out of the ocean. Monsieur put a finger on his forehead. You remind me of something, that I say a bunch of things. What has become of our little observatory in all this? The three men looked at each other. Suddenly Raoul jumped toward a cupboard and opened it, exposing the special screen that allowed them to observe the outside. This screen was set to a receiving plate. Jolt and Monsieur had taken advantage of the winter and the monster's slowed life to climb up through the skull ships and fix this plate onto the forehead bone. With an impatient hand, Raoul pressed a button. The screen remained opaque. Monsieur swore. Jolt cast an anxious look at the large anatomical screen. A dark stain was blackening the image of the beast in front of the forehead bone. She didn't move, said the apprentice, of course. But what's her state? Jolt hesitated, scrutinizing the image. Oh, you know, the transformation hasn't changed much in that area there. I don't think the panel has been too badly damaged. Whether or not it's been badly damaged, we need to fix it, said the pilot. Where are we going? Of course we'll have to be careful. But after all, we have already succeeded in this feat once. You speak so easily, Jolt. The traffic and all the functions of the monster were very slowed down by the wind. The intern armed himself with a wand and pointed to the rocket on the screen. We're there. No difficulties in exiting the digestive system. It hasn't changed much either. The gastric fistula always opens into a very loose conjuncture. They came out of the airlock and slid along the side of the rocket. They adjusted their lights. 3 beams of light penetrated the liquid depths. Jolt lifted his head to look at the apparatus. It's still holding, he said. With cable serving as catgut, the rocket was securely fastened in a fold of the mucosa. Jolt counted his steps. He reached a plastic flap sealing the fistula. He opened it to jump headlong into an elastic mass. His 2 companions followed and closed behind him. Armed with a kind of saber that Raoul had made for him, Jolt cut his way through without taking any extraordinary precaution. He was content to avoid the real high-voltage cables and key vessels, without worrying about the hundreds of mollusks weighing down their boots. The 3 men walked along a vein resembling a pipeline. They advanced easily through fragile fibers, like in a cellar full of spider webs. From time to time, Jolt stopped for a moment to think and consulted a map that he held in his hand. Do you know what you remind me of? Monsieur laughed. A mail lost on the Tlante Metro. Jolt smiled. He touched the huge vein that branched out at that point. We are at the brachio-cerebral station, if I may put it like that. It is time to change lines, but be careful. There is an extremely well-connected plexus here that did not exist last time. If you touch it, you die. They carefully stepped over heaps of black filaments and progressed along a less thick vein. They crawled on their bellies over the convolutions of the vessel. From their stretched-out bodies they felt the pulse of the monster. Every minute a fantastic current rumbled in the helmets, and it was an unparalleled sensation to hold against one's body this giant life. Soon, the vein split again and formed vermiculating deltas at the very edge on a hard floor. We're there, said Joel. We are approaching the front. The plate is not far away anymore. They found it a few dozen meters away, lifted in the middle by a new apophysis that also stretched the skin of the skull like a tent canvas. The 3 men disturbed the conjunctive spider webs of the dermis around them. Monsieur examined the plate. She had suffered fatal twists in its operation. The networks were to be broken in 1,000 points. He shrugged and made a gesture to the quartermaster. He handed him a new roll. Monsieur spread it out carefully on the side of the apophyse. like pasting an advertisement on a wall. He rummaged in his thigh pocket and pulled out a pile. He slipped the object into a cylindrical cavity adjacent to the plate and tripped some wires. Without pampering the equipment, he placed a second plate on the other side of the apophysis. "We'll have 2 eyes," he said. "It will be fine, Jolt." The intern was finishing up scanning the frontal epidermis. He nodded reassuringly. 2 meters, he announced. Monsieur gestured with contempt at this negligible thickness. "Let's go down." "Tell me," the chief petty officer asked, "if I were to be circled under my skin, I feel that it would make me hurt like crazy. She is hard, that beast." "We always take care not to brush against any nerve fibers," Jolt explained. It should be no surprise. 2 hours later they had re-entered the rocket and were gazing at the landscape of the surface on the screens. The colors of sea and islands, modified by the infrared rays, took on an infernal aspect. Purple waves licked interminably the beaches of embers. Golden liquid oozed down from the cliffs like molten metal. "Nice little spot. Ironisa the Master Chief." "It's a trick," said Monsieur. "A frigid polar breeze rules this planet." After a quarter of an hour of curiosity, Jolt returned to the anatomical screens. He jumped. "Hey!" he shouted as the monster moved. Slowly the short legs executed awkward swats. Monsieur's eyes darted back and forth between screens several times. "We're approaching a beach," he said. "I bet." "Yes, look, Jolt!" The beast's belly was flattening out rapidly. "It's dragging itself on the seabed," the pilot exclaimed. The cabin rumbled with a slight tremor. "Hang on!" "Its walk will be less graceful than its swim." They quickly passed the hooks of their straps on the railings. The force of the tremors increased. The rebound shook the thick carcass of the beast without mercy. Monsieur caught the anxious look of the intern. He reassured him. "The screens will hold," he assured. "It works. He's going to come out of the water. We're pros." The floor suddenly dipped. The 3 men felt themselves being hanged by the waist, and then fell backwards again. The helmet of Raoul fell on the floor. He tried to bring it back to him by stretching out his leg, but the object rolled out of reach. The cabin made several slow turns. A loud bang came from the room next door. Something had let go. 4 pushed by a blade more powerful than the others. The monster lost its balance. It rolled on one side, feeling itself knocked down by the wave until it was in the middle of the beach. Dazed by bursts of new sensations, he lay prostrate in the wet sand. Never before had the thunder and the hammering of the blades on the rocks come so close to his dazzled senses, nor had the greedy sucking of the sea on the gravel and shells. He relished obscenely the caresses of a lighter fluid over his naked skin. A pulverulent warmth warmed his entrail, and the comfortable pressure of her belly gave her a less vague sense of her own body. She felt keenly and accurately the horizontal expanse of the beach and the verticality of the harsh cliffs. This universe was less ethereal than the other, more tangible, more secure. It fostered esbozes of perceptions, promised the distant awakening of a rudimentary intelligence. But still trembling at the base of his spine, the beast advanced. Unconsciously he stretched out 6 limbs, leapt a few meters into the air, remained motionless for a moment, and then continued its ponderous march forward, punctuated by hesitant stops. Behind him, his belly left a deep trail, flanked by the heavy footprints of his paws. Its path wound from the sea to the cliffs. She gazed at the scattered creatures, jostling to get out of their sand-stunned sleep. Her horned head butted stupidly into the rock wall that bounded the beach. Hypnotized by that hard contact, she remained still for a moment and then, stubbornly, pushed in front of it. The obstacle resisted. Sharp ridges injured her monster's lips. Embarrassed, she shifted her effort, turned, and followed the cliff all around. He encountered loose debris, struggled to get out of it, and fell asleep with his nose in the gravel. Monsieur and Jolt unbuckled their belts. Monsieur approached Raoul, who was hanging like a puppet on the railing, with a shattered skull. He leaned over the body. "Help me, Jolt," he said, while grabbing the corpse under the armpits. The apprentice took the legs. They hobbled along the corridors in silence under the weight of their comrade. They laid the body down in front of the door of the most distant cabin. Monsieur looked up at the young doctor. "Is there really nothing to be done?" he asked. Jolt widened his eyes, then shook his head and sighed. "Really nothing." Monsieur shrugged. "I'm an idiot. We still expect miracles from medicine. I was going to ask for a resurrection." "Not with the smashed skull," said the intern in a hushed voice. Monsieur opened the metal door and said, "He will have a single room. No question of putting him with the others. The smell of the morgue must be terrible. It would spread all over the rocket. They laid the corpse on a stretcher, bloodied it." Monsieur locked the door. Then, with kind of rage, he threw that key at the other end of the corridor. Jolt turned away and slowly took the path to the latch. The pilot followed him. Jolt examined the damage. The transmitter had come loose. He had bounced from one partition to the other, tearing his cables, crushing his delicate organs. The little sentence repeated for 6 months was finally silent forever. F-1313 accidented. To what purpose? Thought Monsieur as he lowered his head. Then he straightened his back, banished the despair. They walked into the next room and brought their attention back to the screens. The bright image of the monster was perfectly immobile. Only the heart was contracting powerfully, at long intervals. "And now," said the trainee. Monsieur scrutinized the exterior screens. He looked out at the beach, the rock slide, the flickering expanse of the sea. "Kill him," he said. "I have thought it over. We cannot take any more risks by letting him live. I know very well that we will have a hard time getting the rocket out of the corpse, but it is to be hoped that decomposition will help us. And if he should spit us back into the sea, and if he hounds the rocket after having regurgitated it. Perhaps you are right," said Jolt with a faded voice. Monsieur gave him a cautious look. "You have something to say." Jolt hesitated. "No, Captain, not at all. It's only—" "What?" "I wonder if the beach is an ideal takeoff area." Monsieur clenched his jaw. The apprentice was getting on his nerves. "Let me judge for myself," he said. "What's bothering you?" "Well, say it then. I am sure you have other reasons to hide from me." Jolt had an unsettling smile. "Forgive me, Cap. I admit that I am looking for flimsy excuses to save the monster." "Do you like beasts?" snarled the pilot. "I love this one. It is a bit my work. But do not take notice of my feelings. I would be completely crazy if I did," Monsieur said in an acrid voice. He tried to upset his companion, found a cruel reflection. "Don't worry, my little one. For a long time I have thought that the transformation of the monster is quite normal. As I told you a few months ago, this frog has become a toad. I don't think your intervention has anything to do with it. You can put away your paternal inhibitions." Jolt turned scarlet red. "For reasons you would not understand because you are not a biologist. I am sure of the opposite. And he stopped, pulled out a notebook from his pocket, sat down, eyes glistening with tears, and began writing something on a loose sheet. "Yes?" Monsieur threatened, a smile of contempt on his lips. Jolt did not reply. The point of his pencil hovered over the white sheet of paper, piling up sentences. Monsieur couldn't take it anymore. His palm slammed onto the young man's shoulder. He stood him up. The pencil fell to the ground. Jolt trembled and stiffened. Redder than ever before, he clenched his fists and tapped his foot in a military fashion. He handed the paper to his superior. Monsieur released his grip and grabbed the sheet of paper. Jolt availed himself of the opportunity to leave, saluted and left the room, silent as a carp. Monsieur read this: Captain Rahl is dead. It would be difficult for us to live on two. This phenomenon is well known. We are going to mutually go crazy for months. It is a perfectly normal animal reaction, I would say. And yet, we like each other very much. It is absolutely necessary to overcome these fits of nerves, or it will all end badly. For my part, I will always obey you with a discipline that. He crumpled the paper in his hand and balled it up. He remained immobile for a good moment. Then, little by little, he regained his calm and smile, coughed, trying to put as much sweetness as possible into his voice. "Jolt!" he cried. "We've had quite a lot of emotions lately. How about a drink to clear our heads?" The intern entered, bottle in hand. "I had the same idea, Captain." Then he paled, his gaze glued to the external screen. "The tide is rising," he said. When the first waves brushed the sides of the monster, its skin came to life with a shiver. One of its hind legs reached out into the sand. He yawned just as a stronger wave came over him from the side. His mouth gaped open, and he gulped down several tons of liquid chlorine by force. He was unpleasantly surprised by this, and slowly got to his feet among the debris. After a few meters, he put 2 paws on a wobbly rock. All his weight rested on this unstable support. When the rock tipped over, it lost its balance and rolled into the sea, which received it with a triumphant splash. A sudden chill shook her actions. Her paws moved in untidy fashion. At first, frightened by the ocean's tyranny opposing her will, she managed to turn on her back and let herself be carried with a certain pleasure. Then a confused nostalgia assailed her, nostalgia of forgotten sensations. She splashed heavily into the waves and set sail for the open sea. He felt hungry and dove deep. His open mouth swallowed a few hundred suckers. He swam as fast as possible, searched for other schools, found them, filled his belly with easy prey. In an instant he was several miles from the islands, but after an hour of diving, anxiety drew him to the surface. Already, exhaustion was numbing his limbs. He longed to find dry land again and its tranquil stability. He drifted for a while, let the winds of salt play in the 1,000 convolutions of his membrane, regained his strength. A slow, grieving swim brought him back to the island. From time to time, the tip of his fins just brushed against the retreating edge of the shallow seabed. He became entangled in a maze of coral reefs and almost tore his belly open. Returned to the open sea. Came back, tried to find his way again. He touched the cliffs, but the beaches had disappeared under the tide. He was exhausted on the steep sides of an island, scratched at the rocks, fell back into the waves. He wandered randomly in the currents that gradually pushed him towards the shore. The incoming tide left him in a smoking puddle, like a dead beast, like a wreck draped with seaweed, surrounded by swarms of insects. Around him, a vast muddy beach gradually revealed itself, riddled with whirlpools created by the waves, stained with colorful streaks. The place was teeming with screeching birds searching for food in the debris dumped by the sea. They crept forward in leaps. Their wings were too heavy to take off. Their awkward wings supported only failed launches. A few, however, managed to soar a few meters by jumping from a ridge. They fiercely fought for a piece of carrion. Pestilential odors rose from the vases. Higher up, some dunes supported blue-tinged plants, guarded by thorns in the shape of daggers. Then there were the marshes, stretching out to infinity, sometimes dominated by a straight tree like a candle, and finished with a kind of luminous feather duster. This scene was a nightmare for the sleeping monster. "He has to get out of that puddle," said the pilot. "It's drying out rapidly, but the tide will come and fill it up again in a few hours. Could you rouse him, Jolt?" "I'll do it. But imagine if he got it into his head to go back to the bath. That's a risk we run. But I think that risk is minimal. He has his nose pointed towards the dunes. He will advance straight ahead of him." "Well," said the apprentice, "but we don't have time to lose. I have for a long time on paper found a formula of nervous stimulus. Lan Sin can make me 20 liters in 2 hours. I think that this amount will be enough. But where to find nitrogen? You need it. It is essential. Our air, no." Exploded Messiah. "We are not going to pollute our vital environment. I know where to find this nitrogen." Jolt waited for the sequel. Messiah had an embarrassed gesture. "To the morgue," he said. "Ammonia and its derivatives are the end products of all putrefaction. You will easily get your nitrogen from them." Jolt blushed violently. Messiah looked him in the eye. "I know," he said. "Our religion forbids us to use human corpses for anything, and we are so steeped in childhood complexes that we feel guilt over this sacrilege. But, for heaven's sake, what? Jolt, you're a scientist. You know as well as I do the deeper reasons behind these taboos." Jolt lowered his eyes. Messiah insisted. "I respect the principles of our religion." "I've said the principles. But all these small hygiene details imposed in past ages don't concern us. On Earth I would also observe them, to set an example for the crowd and the barbarian peoples. My word, if I saw one of my May or Iopti slaves return to their necrophagic practices, I would kill him with my own hands, or deliver him to the priests." "Don't try to convince me," Jolt interrupted. "I know you're absolutely right. I'm probably still too young to have your freedom of thought. But I'll do what you want." "Good for you," said Messiah. "It would have offended me to give you an order that contradicted your convictions. To completely reassure you, I will add that I am the highest ranking of us two, so the substitute priest on this ship. Remember the sacred legend of the Roman god who had surprised a soldier drinking the blood of a comrade dead at his side. 'Soldier,' he said to him, 'if you know what you are doing, you are blessed and have nothing to fear. But if you don't know it, woe to you. For you have broken the law, and it would be better if you were dead of thirst.' Well, we know what we're doing, Joel. We get nitrogen where it is, that's all. I doubt the Roman god will come for this and pull our legs." The ensign seemed to purr contentedly. Down the long tube leading to the morgue, it sucked in masses of noxious gas, made its choice, separated them into simple elements. The needle indicating the amount of nitrogen crept slowly up to the maximum. Jolt waited a few more minutes. When the needle touched the red point, he lowered a knob. The machine stopped. The apprentice consulted a piece of paper and pressed about 20 buttons, repeating the complicated formula of the body to be obtained. He put the current back on. Lamps blinked. The ensign purred on a lower pitch. Jolt set a slider blocking production at 20 liters. He went to find Messiah, who was making plans in the next room. The pilot took his eyes off his work. "Does it work?" he inquired. Jolt nodded. "Me too," said Messiah, showing his papers. "Once we get out of this silly situation that has paralyzed us for so long, it will be simple to finish what chance has begun. We'll cut the rocket in two. The work is half done. Next, the jet nozzles will have to be changed and a new balance created by adding 2 veins here and there. My calculations are very reassuring. We have 9 chances in 10 of making it." "So much the better, Captain." A flash of gaiety passed over the pilot's eye. "What I like about you, Jolt, is your calm and your just sense of reflection. Tant mieux. I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you fine weather tomorrow." He stood up and hit him on the shoulder. "Once you're back," he said, "you won't be a trainee for long. After such a crew, they'll make you a head researcher. As for me, by the gods, They'll make me an admiral. What do you think about that? Jolt didn't reply. He was distracted by other thoughts. Pardon me, he said. What? For the love of a dog, Jolt blurted out and ran to the lab, where the ensign had stopped mid-sentence. They checked all the connections on the machine before realizing it was a general failure. A few minutes of searching revealed the truth. The central batteries were dead. Monsieur was working as a stable hand. We're clean. Such things never happen yet. It's true that we should have joined the base months ago. Jolt looked up at the individual lamps fixed to the ceiling. By connecting all the batteries in series, he ventured, "We could run the ensign, okay," said Monsieur. "But there are more urgent things. Avez-vous pensé au chauffage? Il fait moins 30 dehors. Et le renouvellement d'oxygène, y avez-vous pensé? Si nous ne trouvons pas de solution, nous n'avons plus qu'à faire nos prières. La dépense d'énergie nécessaire au chauffage et à l'oxygène épuisera les piles individuelles en 15 jours." Jolt jeta un regard de regret aux écrans morts, mais son visage s'illumina soudain. "Lennis," he said, "Monsieur, the nerves of the monk. We must be able to get energy from it." Monsieur remained silent for a moment. "Thank the gods," he finally said. "In these trials they gave me the company of a small genius." "Do you have any idea about the nature of the current? During the winter, I placed the shunts all over." "Out of curiosity," Jolt admitted. "They are continuously passed through by a very high-frequency alternating current. In the event of excitation, the current becomes direct. But that is not a major problem. We have all the necessary equipment. To the scuba diving equipment, Monsieur," as they raised a war cry. "I-5 believers dead. Hundreds of birds pecked at the monster's head and sides while it slept. Their awakening sent them running. To their regret, they flew off to the sidelines and quarreled over smaller prey, making much noise with their beaks and shrill cries. Once again, the monster wanted a bath. His sleep and digestion had restored his strength. He turned heavily towards the distant sea, but an odd paralysis affected his right side. The muscles in his legs responded poorly to his obscure will. The derivation of some nerves for the rocket was the cause. Slowly, influenced by this asymmetry of effectiveness, his path curved. He made a wide circle, splashed through the wet sand, and headed up the dunes. He backed off, resumed his oblique course, and banged into the drought-ridden hills for the second time. He stood still for about a quarter of an hour, then persisted. His third try was even shorter. A confined effort led him to a raised, soft ground, which he crossed to fall into the swamps. There he stayed. A sensation of ideal comfort held him in these places, which were neither sea nor solid earth. No waves to exhaust him. No too flat contact which crushed his stomach, but the balanced pressure of the vases around his too heavy mass for his legs. He opened his mouth in a heavy liquid of slippery prey, swallowed several tons of delicious mud, chewed packs of algae. Plunged into an environment made for him, he no longer suffered from the impotence of his right side. Nature offered him all the comforts at home. He no longer needed to drag himself on tiring shopping trips, and the vast ocean spaces were no longer necessary to his moisture needs. Peat, He stretched his limbs in the foggy warmth. He reclined as on a bed. Far above, a blue-white sun cast a halo in the chlorine mists. A bleary yet rich-toned light bathed the wicker trees' flames and melted into frissons on the surface of the bogs. Messier raged for about a good quarter of an hour against bad luck. He blamed Jolt for not having stopped the beast on solid ground. "And now," he said, "she will never come out of these marshes again. She seems to enjoy it. We need to find something else, by God. But our first concern should be to set up a button-pressing device that can kill her with one blow. Once we're all set on this side, we'll look for a way to get her back to the dunes." He stopped abruptly, surprised by his friend's silence. Jolt was sitting on a cot, his face red. He seemed to be panting. "You okay?" Messier asked in a softer tone. "Nothing." "Just nothing at all," the intern panted. He loosened his diving suit collar as if he was too hot. "Are you sick?" asked the pilot, approaching. "Claustrophobia." Jolt shot back briefly. "I can't stand feeling trapped in there anymore. We'll kill him, Captain, right now." Come on, grumbled Messier, taking his hand. "Calm down, old man. We've already risen from the bottom of the sea. That's progress. We will succeed soon." He forced him to lie down. Jolt seemed to be gradually calming down. "It's stupid," he said. "Purely mental. If the rocket flew into space, I wouldn't feel this anxiety. And yet I wouldn't have any more room at my disposal. It's about being in this monster for months. I won't stand it much longer." He gulped his saliva and added, "This is not the first time. But I always kept it hidden from you. A moment ago, when I saw the monster returning to the water, I had a shock. And the chokes took me. Thought everything was lost." "Not at all," exploded the pilot. "We can still do a lot of things. We should make it mute again. Turn it into a lizard, a kangaroo. Too long." Jolt interrupted him, "and too risky." Messier hit his forehead. "We'll get it out by directly stimulating its motor nerves. See already the effect of the galvanic derivation of a single nerve obtained. We didn't do that on purpose, but it's something to perfect." The doctor seemed interested. "Yes," he said. "That must be possible, isn't it?" The pilot exclaimed, seeing his friend forget his ailments. "You've done better than that before, old man. For you, this will just be another biological hack. The last one. If we can get this monster going as easily as a truck, we're saved." Jolt stood up. He examined the monster's nerve network, spread out in yellow, tree-like structures on the screen. "Fascinating," he said. "We need to build up a power reserve, if I may put it that way, to distribute as we see fit. I'm thinking." He thought for a moment, grabbed some paper, and threw down a few figures. He continued, "That's another brilliant idea, Captain." Messier let out a confident laugh. "I'll eventually convince myself that we're extraordinary types." For weeks now, the beast had been living in a state of near ecstasy, euphoria. It barely moved. It only opened its mouth when it was hungry. And its mouth would trap easy prey. When he'd bothered it, it would slide lower into the mud. And if the funds are too fresh, it slowly emerged, like a dragon draped in smoking seaweed. 2 or 3 times, dark fancies had pushed him further. With drunken gestures of his 6 limbs, he had crossed stretches of humidity linking pits to puddles, tepid marshes to chains of ponds. He had blissfully wandered into a maze of amusements, with ever new flavors. With head in the grass and body in the mud, he was digesting calmly. A stir in his thighs brought him out of his sleepiness. He stretched. One limb had a spasm and scratched the bank. A reflex pushed 2 other lads forward, then 2 more. His head emerged 5 good meters from the grass. He wanted to retreat, but his fingers were already firmly caught in the bog, and pulled him further away. Slowly, a heavy stupor settled upon him, as his body ripped itself free of the vase's sucking. He covered another 20 meters without thinking to struggle. Then he suddenly bucked. But instead of opposing his walk, his efforts accelerated it in an unruly way. Staggering, he tumbled over his stiff limbs like short horses and climbed a rounded hillock. "Stop!" shouted Messire. Strapped to his seat, Jolt locked the controls and pressed down with his heel, restoring alternating current to the monster's nerves. Violent shake shook the rocket. The straps of Messire broke. He rolled on the ground and got up unscathed. A broad smile illuminated his sweaty face under the helmet. "This time," he said. Jolt smiled back. "Let's kill him now." Messire raised his hand. "Wait." He went to check a dial and said slowly, "We have stored enough energy for 15 months. This is our last chance. Once the monster is dead, we won't have any more power. The little gymnastics that we've just made him do has halved his stores." He stood silent for a moment. Then, with regret, he pulled one of the levers. At 20 meters away, a trap filled with poison opened up, spilling liters of red liquid into the monster's stomach. Jolt scanned the anatomical screen. He saw the heart pumping abnormally once, twice. They waited for 10 minutes for the third pulse. To no avail. "Nada wobbly, finally," he said. Jolt untied his straps. Unconsciously he spoke quietly, as in a morgue room. "It's over," he blurted stupidly. He regretted the huge beast that had been their prison for so long, their companion in misery and their safeguard. Without it they would have remained irretrievably at the bottom of a sea of chlorine. "It was a brave monster," said Messire with a tempered touch of irony. "And now a new task awaits us. I think it'll be easier. We are still shipwrecks, but we are no longer lost at sea." Third, Part 1. The skeleton of the monster rose from the mound like a ruined cathedral. The winds of chlorine played on the organ between its curved ribs, blew discordant echoes through the sinuses of its skull. A few membrane flags floated at the angles of its spine. The chairs had soon disappeared, liquefied by accelerated putrefaction. Rising from the surrounding marshes, the candle trees watched over the corpse. The rocket, slowly freed from the embrace of the dead tissues, had slipped aside, settled into a fold in the ground that prevented it from sliding down to the pond. In lightweight helmets, the 2 men were busy working on the hull, clutching their vibrators in hand. They cut through plates according to a calculated path drawn up by Messire. They chatted. "And your eggs?" asked the pilot. "They've gotten even bigger. Real melons. I'm sure the monster laid them while it was flying its last flight. It's impossible for there to be any other eggs on its trail." The intern cast a casual glance at the deep ditch leading from the marshes to the hill. "What do you think will come out of it?" the pilot asked. "Fish or frogs? How should I know?" They worked in silence for another quarter of an hour. Suddenly, Messire turned off his vibrator. "Let's take a break," he said. "The metal is getting hot. Let's go look at your eggs." They put down their instruments and slid to the ground. Those who stayed above, if I may say so, are lost. They shrunk like dried fruits. Only those who bathe in the puddles will prosper. They splashed through spongy terrain. "See," said Jolt, pointing at something. He shot an egg as if it were a ball. The boot was stained with verdigris spots. From 10 meters to 10 meters, the monster's heavy legs had left deep footprints, turned into pools by seepage. Jolt dipped his gloves into the first puddle he came across. He pulled out a jelly-like and translucent ball, a big grape-sized grape. He brandished it in 2 hands in the sunlight to look inside. At the center of the soft sphere floated a bud coiled on itself. "Well?" said Messire. Before answering, Jolt carefully placed the egg down where he had found it. He stood up and wiped his gloves off on his thighs. "It sort of resembles a fish embryo," he declared. "But that doesn't mean anything if ontogeny isn't complete. A tadpole embryo is also pisiform. All terrestrial organized beings recapitulate all the phases of an ancestral phylogenetic. The human egg is just a protozoan, an amoeba. Then we are sea urchins, then amphibians. It's impossible for me to say where the development of these embryos will stop, but I think they are doomed to the dilemma of fish or frog. As far as these words mean anything here, do you know what I think?" said Messire, slowly returning to the terrace. Jolt had a face of ignorance. "It was us who fertilized the monster. The mutagen treatment gave it a parthenogenic shock." "It's possible," admitted the intern, "unless the beast has mingled with kith and kin before we met, but—" He made a gesture of impotence and concluded, "It matters not. What I'm interested in is whether this induced mutation is transmissible." "I know it's a shame for you," said Messire, "but I'm more interested in getting out of here. Your brilliant observations would take such time. If I let you, that you wouldn't have any chance of benefiting the terrestrial science." "When will you give me back my microscopes and files?" asked Jolt, like a child asking for a toy. Messire had a slight laugh. "When we fly into space," he said, "be assured everything is locked up. Safe. Your photographs of the physiological screen, your tissue samples, your slices, your eggs in jars, your preserves of I don't know what. When I take over the controls, you can have fun with all that as much as you want. For now, I need manpower." Without warning, he pushed Jolt into the mud with his shoulder and sprawled out next to him. "Shh," he whispered. Dazed, Jolt felt like he was being blown in the ear and shook his head to detach his audio processor. Lying a few feet from him, the pilot pointed at the mound. Jolt looked. He distinguished the cut mass from the great skeleton rising out of the mists and guessed the oblong shape of the rocket. "Cut your lamp off, by the gods!" swore Messire's voice in the audiophone. The intern obeyed without understanding. He no longer saw anything but a wall of fog, felt lost in a gigantic yellow cocoon. A colossal shadow fell like night over the 2 men. "What's happening?" Jolt gasped. His blindness was driving him crazy. He nearly shouted when Messire touched his shoulder. "We're being visited," the pilot whispered. "Have you seen anything?" "Nothing." "Some kind of—" A grating of metal cut off his words, followed by several dull thuds like bomb explosions in the ground. The explosions were getting closer. A trail of dirty liquid reflected off the 2 men lying down. A violent wind made waves of chlorine in the marshes. Day broke with silence. Messire wiped his window with a handful of grass. He relit his lamp between them and the mound. The damp prairie was pitted with potholes, like after a bombing. Messire pointed. "His tracks," he said. "Charming little bug. It looked like a ceratosaur and flew off like a bird." Dazed, the apprentice slowly stood up, keeping his arms apart from his body as they dripped with mud. He repeated stupidly in echo. "Yes," said Messire. "That's why there was such a huge shadow. Its wings had been over 100 meters in span, and that wind—" The bog still sloshed waves on the vase beaches. Delician reeds swayed together. The wand's flames undulated like a candle's in a breeze. "I hope we don't get too many more of these little intermissions," said Jolt, chomping his teeth. They climbed up the hillock. The rocket wasn't touched. They went back to work without a word, aware of the battle against time. For on this alien planet, an accident could destroy their hopes in the blink of an eye. The eggs of the monster hatched after a few days. They first swelled up, then burst like soap bubbles, releasing fish all similar to the monster before its up. Transformation, but of smaller size. Jolt had all the trouble in the world to prevent the pilot from destroying them one by one. Grudgingly, Messier granted them a reprieve. "Think," he said with some reason, "that this place can become the lair of hundreds of monsters like the first one. It would be untenable." The intern outmaneuvered him by saying, "You'll kill a few hundred, but what about all those who are unreachable in the middle of the marsh?" Useless to waste our time and ammunition on an unfinished job. Messier was brought to this conclusion for the moment, but he now and then cast an angry glance at the boiling pools. The continuation satisfied him. Well, those monsters did grow indeed, but they would have needed the space of the sea to survive. Slowly, their size made them impotent. In every marsh, a dozen animals as large as dolphins soon choked each other to death. In the marshes, they grew to the size of a whale before dying for the same reasons. The mother monster had been 300 meters long. Messier sang victory, and Jolt mourned the spoils surrounded by vulture birds. The mutation wasn't hereditary. Or perhaps it would have been better to leave the animals time to fatten up before making that claim, but something had escaped the notice of both men. Less absorbed by slave labor, roused by a biology very different from terrestrial biology, Jolt could have noted disturbing facts. His attention was limited only to eggs laid in liquid chlorine. He had concluded a little too quickly that the eggs left on dry land were dead. These apparently withered. They took on the color of the ground, half buried themselves in grassy mud. No longer noticeable, yet they lived. One day 1,000 curious heads rose from the earth. In the morning, Jolt put on a diving suit and left early. Absorbed all day long by manual labor, he liked to wander alone around the area, despite the warnings of prudence. These short walks were essential for his balance. Every day he spent at least an hour collecting shells and insects. He sat on the hill and gazed at the desolate landscape, where the carcasses of monsters were finishing off rotting. Several times already he had encountered a species of small red lizards, the size of a hand and with a crest on their backs that changed color. Heavy from his boots, he never managed to catch them. The small animals were running out of reach on their quick 6 legs, and even when he believed that he had them safely caught with a cautious approach, Jolt saw them disappear in the blink of an eye by acrobatic leaps. One day the intern leaned down to pluck a plant he had never seen before, when the mud crept out of a big bubble, right where his hand was going to land. Startled, Jolt saw something move at the bottom of the funnel-like trough with fluted sides. He leaned in further and saw a lizard slowly emerge. He grabbed it between 2 fingers and pulled it out. Though smaller, the animal was clearly from the species that always mocked his efforts with its speed. Even the same red tint, even the same crest, and 6 agile legs that gradually became more agile, wiggling desperately. Without letting go of the organism, Jolt dug through the mud with his other hand and unearthed the remnants of a hard-boiled egg. He was shocked. It was one of the eggs he had believed to be dead. The discovery was sensational. Thus, the eggs that hatched in water produced monsters resembling the gigantic primitive fish, but the eggs that opened in the vicinity of the gaseous chlorine gave lizards. The little creatures, agile, were sisters of these huge corpses filling the marshes. In essence, the monster's offspring constituted a regression if she was born in the liquid, a progress as soon as she saw the day on solid ground. For the apparent anatomy of lizards showed net evolutionary progress on their gigantic mother. They had a more slender figure, were no longer handicapped by this inconvenient goitra that impeded the other one's gait, and their flexibility contrasted with the pudgy look of the large amphibian. Feverish, Jolt searched for other eggs. He found only spongy debris from which the inhabitants had already escaped. He returned his attention to his catch and made a gesture of disappointment. Absorbed in thought, he had not felt the animal slip out of his glove. He now had in his hand only a broken tail, heroically abandoned by the fugitive. The lizard had acted like some terrestrial reptiles. Jolt wondered if a new appendage would repulse the animal. "Well, Jolt," said Messier's voice in his helmet's audiophone. "It's time to get back to work." The intern turned her head and saw the pilot descend the ladder of the airlock, tools on his shoulder. Jolt tucked her small tail into her pocket and returned to the rocket. "It's the final act," said Messier merrily. "Just a few pipe fittings to install, and we can take off. Freedom is approaching, my old man. I see it in a month." Jolt chased the lizards out of her thoughts. He decided to talk to the pilot a little later. He unloaded his companion of half the tools, and they walked together toward the tail of the rocket. For an hour they worked in silence. The machine had long been split in two. The two men dismantled much of the equipment from the sacrificial portion to raise it on the other. Jolt did what Messier ordered. He didn't always understand the reasons for the pilot's actions, and was amazed by his technical knowledge. Leaving with half a rocket seemed like a challenge to him. 2 or 3 times he had confided in Messier about these concerns, but his companion's calm confidence swept away his doubt. The cacophony of manual labor had a stimulating and numbing effect at the same time. The shrill whine of drills tore through the anxiety. The imperative chut of the compressors imposed silence on the apprehensions, and doubt surrendered to the noise of the automatic hammering. Jolt thus discovered an original therapy for the din and effort against psychosis. This cacophonous work had chased away the nightmares and chokes that used to disturb his nights long ago. Lost in confused thoughts, he worked like a robot. He had given up counting the number of giant nuts installed that morning. The 200th, perhaps, was spinning at full speed in front of him, while the crankshaft made his arm muscles vibrate. A grating stop, a jolt in the gloves. Next, he turned to pick up another nut and remained with hanging arms. The pile of nuts was gone entirely. A few meters away, the welder from Messier stopped moaning. The pilot threw an affectionate glance at the apprentice. "I kept you in my eyes," said Messier. "You were so absorbed that you could not believe you had finished." Jolt smiled in turn. "I'm completely fucked up," he said. Messier stretched his huge body into the mist. He yawned without shame. A roar of indiscretion tore Jolt's ear. "Can we stop for a moment?" said Messier. "Before I continue, there's a small issue that needs to be resolved for the booster reactor setup." Jolt sat in the grass, prickly as a rug. "Booster reactor," he said slowly. I heard those words. "I'm not an expert on rockets, but it seems like an old system, isn't it?" Of course, the pilot approved. "But what's the alternative?" This is the translation of the text into English. "It'll be like outfitting a modern cruiser with a canvas and a rudder. But it still works, you know, as long as you know how to sail." "Calm down. I'm an old-school type." There were no fiction 30s around all the time. I was lucky enough to fly 10s and older birds like the Sag. Doesn't that ring a bell? Jolt made a vague gesture. Too young. It was quite an art to navigate in those days. We didn't have gyroscopes, mobile screens, and all these gizmos that weigh down today's ships. You'll see I haven't forgotten this art, Jolt. We're going to sail like in the good old days. Jolt wondered how old the pilot could be. 11 had almost no wrinkles, but his hair was lightly graying at the temples and added to his personality. The intern felt overwhelmed by the force emanating from Messier, in his way of speaking and the calm assurance of his gestures. The pilot belonged to that type of men who do not age from 30 to 85. The indestructible kind, Jolt couldn't have known that Monsieur would live for millennia more. No, neither of the men suspected this at the moment. Monsieur himself didn't know he would speak his last words some 10,000 years later. The apprentice was pulled out of his thoughts by a rustling on his thigh. He leapt to his feet and put his hand in his pocket. He pulled the lizard's tail, to the pilot's surprised gaze. "What is it?" asked Monsieur. Jolt didn't answer right away. He was as surprised as his companion. Indeed, the tail wasn't there. Alone. 2 clawed legs were flicking at the edges of the crack. "Like this, for example," he said. Jolt didn't know if the lizard who had escaped felt its tail regenerating, but he had to admit the broken tail was reconstituting a new red lizard from front to back. Monsieur had given the intern the key to his scientific paradise. "I don't need you any more," he had told him. "Have fun with your animals. I'll only ask for help now and then." At first, Monsieur had been suspicious of this invasion of lizards, which were extremely prolific. He tried unsuccessfully to exterminate them, fearing a dangerous development. But the species seemed to have settled permanently in a harmless type of animal, and as every attempt at destruction had only resulted in a revival of the species' vitality, the pilot had forgotten his murderous plans. Jolt was swimming in the joys of discovery. He classified, labeled, weighed fluids, dissected tiny organs. He plowed new ground and built a new science all by himself. The pilot's genocide attempts had had surprising effects. Mutilated lizards were dying, but most of them reformed in an anarchic fashion. Broken tails gave birth to strange creatures. In the vivarium he had set up under the carcass of the ancestral monster, Jolt had witnessed entire bodies being regenerated from a simple clawed finger. Often the obscure stream of life stopped too early or too late. And some individuals were no more than 2-legged monsters who dragged themselves painfully before starving to death. Others, on the contrary, extended their lives rapidly, as nature gave them a new pair of front legs every hour before modeling ahead onto the end of an oversized body. All of these phenomena baffled the logic of the apprentice, and he set himself to unraveling their secret. It was like wanting to solve a problem with 1,000 unknowns. However, the eggs always produced normal lizards, big as the palm, crested and spotted. Unlike their ancestor, they had faceted eyes. They creaked around the mound overlooking the meadows and the marshes of chlorids. Some days the landscape was red. But the birds from the nearby beaches came to make a mess of it, and thus regulate their multiplication. Slowly, the huge offspring of the monster had grown accustomed to the presence of the 2 men. Strange to say, they even sought their company. Jolt couldn't wander through the countryside without being surrounded, followed, and fawned upon by dozens of lizards that rubbed against his legs as if they were familiar pets. But while the intern felt a certain emotion, telling himself that he was, after all, their scientific father, Monsieur would sometimes grow irritated and, after giving some scratches, would wave them away with large gestures. Although absorbed in biological research, Jolt had subjected them to some psychological tests. He claimed that their intelligence surpassed that of a dog. He did not know that they were later supposed to approach that of humans, because if their anatomy seemed fixed, their minds still evolved. Plus astute, the apprentice would have noticed a slight modification in the angle of cranium in newborns. As men had only little by little surpassed their simian ancestors, lizards rapidly diverged from their primitive type, and new broods were added daily to the previous ones. One morning Monsieur called the apprentice, who was absorbed in studying a piece of cloth. "Look, a 1-meter-high wall cut all the land languages, and all the isthmuses leading to the dunes. We could see the lizards bustling at the points where the construction was finished. In dozens they rolled balls of wet earth, hoisted them to the top of the parapet, and pounded them with their tails. Why are they doing this?" asked the pilot. I don't know," said Jolt. The important thing is that they do it. In a protective purpose, no doubt. He thought for a moment and added, I know an extraordinary outbreak must take place today. The meadows are full of nests. Maybe they want to protect their offspring from the beach birds. And in fact, carnivorous birds appeared in groups at the top of the dunes. Advertised by instinct, they glared at the territory of the red lizards. They seemed to notice this budding greed. They intensified their effort, carrying branches and stones, sealing the gaps. Crowds of small workers climbed up each other to finish the work, worthy in proportion to the Great Wall of China or the Great Pyramid. The two men could not take their eyes off the spectacle. Jolt was particularly amazed by the skill of these thousands of diligent feet. He had always ignored that they were prehensile. When the eggs began to hatch, the marauding birds descended from the dunes, sliding in leaps, with great flutters of wings. They drunk from the top of the defensive wall, and exhausted themselves with clumsy leaps. Their screams reached the beach. Attracted, groups of fellow creatures climbed up crying over the soft sand hills. They were a crowd at the foot of the rampart. Carried away by some kind of impulso, a few managed to overcome the obstacle. And we saw something extraordinary. For the first time, lizards faced each other. Instead of seeking personal salvation by hiding in their burrows, they rushed en masse at the invaders, grabbed them with their paws, turned them over, and smothered them in a suffocating mob. 20 or so birds entered the enclosure to start their usual slaughter. Without consulting each other, Jolt and Messire slid down the hill and joined the fray. They tossed the intruders over the wall one by one and strengthened the wall by compacting the earth in their gloved hands. "Do as I do," said Messire. He broke off the boughs from the bushes all around and began to stick them into the top of the wall, in a long row slightly leaned towards the outside. Jolt imitated him. After a few minutes of work, Messire looked up. "By the gods!" he cried. "What?" said Jolt. Messire showed him the lizards. These were hanging in groups from the bushes, snapping off branches under their weight, running to the fortress, and planting them as they had seen the two Terrians do. "Wow," said Jolt. "They learn quickly," said Stefan Wul. "I'm glad I helped them." "They really deserve it. Do you think we can teach them mathematics?" "They could finish our rocket for us." Jolt burst out laughing. As the evening drew near, the two men stood on the embankment, tired and satisfied, holding their shovels. They surveyed their work. A double fence, here and there reinforced by fascines, isolated the marshland from the dunes. The prairies had never been so red with lizards. A host of small creatures whirled around the embankment. All had their eyes fixed on the Terrans. "What do they want?" whispered Messire. "Do not laugh at what I am about to say," announced Jolt. "I believe they are thanking us. It's hard to express. I know they're silent, but I feel invaded by a powerful harmony, by an anthem that should strike a sixth sense. I sense we are applauded." Messire doesn't laugh. I feel exactly the same," he says. Sometimes huge crowds would come running from very far away and stay for hours in contemplation before the Terran's work. And these exoduses resembled pilgrimages. Jolt and Messire cut down many candle trees, a material that was both extremely hard and extremely light. They laid them side by side in a sloped trench to serve as a launching ramp for the rocket. Retained by ropes, it was to slide slowly down the side of the hill and stay in an oblique position, with its nose pointed towards the sky. One evening, Messire thought, "There are practically no large trees in this area. Tomorrow we will have to go and cut down about a dozen at 3 kilometers from here. And this part will be transporting them." The next day he found 5 fresh logs cut at the bottom of the mound. The other 5 came one by one in the course of the day, floating down the swamp and drawn by thousands of lizards. "If you had spoken out loud," said Jolt, "I could suppose that they have learnt our language through hearing it. But you thought and they understood that thought with a astonishing precision. 10 trees. Could they count, for heaven's sake? See, said Messire, leaning on a tree trunk. I wonder what they used to cut this. They have no teeth. We must admit they possess tools. To the great surprise of his son, several lizards climbed onto his boot, and standing on their hind legs, brandished quartz crystals. I think we've created a master race, said Jolt with some emotion. That would be the third one, after humans and Venusian Srebs. I wonder if they know we're leaving. Be quiet, said Messire in haste. They would be able to keep us back by. No, don't even think about it. Let's work, my old man, in such a way as not to think at first. We stay, you understand? Put in your mind that we stay. Our dangerous friendships, he concluded, gently shaking the lizards from his boots. He granted them a thought of gratitude for the service rendered. The crowd waved with delight. I believe they feel everything, Messire thought. We have to hide from them that we begin to scare them a little bit. They love us too much. Under the 1,000 eyes of faithful dogs, the two men dumped a trunk on their shoulders and climbed the slope. The trunk seemed to get heavier the higher they climbed. Messire felt Jolt stumble behind him. Hang on, he cried. It's all in your mind. This tree is as light as the others, and we stay on this planet, Jolt. Remember that. We stay. Jolt slipped on one knee. He focused his thoughts on images of a long stay among the lizards. Under his helmet, he was sweating in big drops. He spoke, trying to chase off with words 1,000 dangerous and parasitic thoughts. We'll watch the rocket take off alone, he said to Messire. We'll put it into launch position, and it will soar into the sky while we wave our handkerchiefs. Isn't that so? Yes, nodded Messire. Excellent method. By the gods, Jolt, I can already see her flying off, leaving us forever among our little lizards. They'll give us a big party that day. They will go cut wood for us to build a cabin. We will teach them carpentry and many other things. They took a few steps forward. The trunk seemed lighter to them. They laid it in the trench. The rocket will glide right over there in a wonderful way, said Jolt. It will jump into the air and never come back. Let's go fetch some more logs and hurry up. The sooner we finish this job, the more time we'll have to spend on the lizards. They descended again towards the wood balls. I wonder why they brought those, breathed Jolt. I guess they are wavering between the desire to serve us and the fear of losing themselves. They are also hesitating in interpreting our thoughts. Well, said Messire, don't think too much. Let's work. The rocket can take off tonight without any hope of return. We will then lead an idyllic life among the animals. This planet is delicious, isn't it? I no longer want to see the Earth again. Space travel scares me. Suddenly, the candle trees seemed incredibly light to them. Of all the mental impulses added together, the lizards helped their task. It works, Messire said. Take the wooden wedges between the trunks. I feel strong enough to carry them by myself, and I want to be hanged if I understand anything. They worked without ceasing on a huge task, greased the slide by pouring buckets of oil over it, fixed cables on either side of the rocket, and surrounded them with ropes tied around several tree trunks as a counterweight to absorb much of the effort. When everything was ready, they looked at each other with satisfaction. "Captain tonight?" asked the trainee. "Immediately," replied Messire. "Do you remember the maneuver, right?" "We've practiced it often enough." They positioned themselves halfway up and wrapped the ends of the ropes around their waists. "Make sure your heels are firmly on the ground," ordered Messire. "Grab the rope with your left hand. Lean back with all your weight. Watch out for the rope. I count to 3. On either side of the slider, the two men coordinated their movements. Messire counted. 1, 2, 3. They pulled on the ropes, unshackling the braces. The weight of the rocket cut into their backs. "Be careful," repeated Monsieur, his hands tied to his rope. "I count again." We let 50 centimeters go. By steps, the rocket descended the slope. It slid slowly into a bed made for it. Absorbed by the effort, Jolt did not notice a detail with serious consequences. Above him, the spires formed by the cable around a root slowly approached the free edge. One of them could be released with one shot. All-seeing, Monsieur noticed it. Anxiousness gave him a warm flush under his helmet. "Stop!" he screamed. In a few quick words, he warned his comrade and thought at great speed to find a solution. However, a feeling of guilt troubled his thoughts. He should have provided a safety margin in the nozzles. "Attention, je compte. Attendez, idiote. Mettre à fois. Si la fusée n'est retenue que d'un seul côté, elle va s'incliner légèrement et frotte. Je sais, si compte aussi un peu, ça pourra légèrement effort. Hurry up, old man." Suant and groaning, the body strained. Monsieur raised a little and put his heels in a hole. "Go on," he shouted. Jolt let go of his cable and rushed towards the rock. He got into the slide, but his boots slid on the oil and he lost his balance. He did a spectacular and involuntary slide all the way down. "Quick!" Monsieur cried. "I don't know how long I can hold on." Jolt was racing up the slope. "Too bad," said Monsieur. "Wrap your rope lower around the tree and take the pose again." Breathless, Jolt obeyed, but his gloves were dripping with oil and the rope slipped from his fingers. He made the imprudence of wrapping it several times around his wrists. He leaned back and shouted, "That's fine, Captain. There are now 2 of us." As he said this, he was putting his grease-slicked soles on a round stone. Monsieur felt a bit relieved. He loosened his guard, but the apprentice skidded in one stroke and, drawn by the arms, was thrown against a stump by the cable's traction. Surprised, Monsieur didn't have time to react, and it was a rocket that hit it, and it banged on the slide. He'd only let go of the cable and flung himself on his belly while the rocket bounded out of the chute and rolled down in thunderous noises. "Jolt!" the pilot cried as he rose to his feet. He ran to the apprentice tied to a tree stump like a torture post. Before he broke, the cable had wrapped around him and torn him in 20 places. In front of this tormented body, where patches of spacesuit were ingrained into the flesh, the pilot got a nausea, quickly repressed. He clenched his fists and lowered his head. It was sort of a manly way to burst into sobs. He took heavy steps down the hill and went to inspect the rocket. Fuel was leaking from a tear in the hull. Panicked, Monsieur lay across the opening to stem this fatal bleeding that would ruin his plans. He felt the liquid running down his legs, cast desperate looks around, noticed another break where more fuel was still flowing and boiling on the floor. Frantic, he tumbled the earth in the crevices, succeeded in blinding nearly a way out, ran to the other, and lay down again on the cold metal, hugging the rocket like a beloved, like a blight. Being hard to see dying. But already the first tear opened up spits of earth and vomits in torrents. So the pilot remained lying on the hull, risking to see the fuel dissolve the joints of his helmet. He had several sobs, without tears. He did not fear death. But this series of victories and defeats, lasting for months to end in a definitive failure, had broken his nerve resistance. Afraid, the lizards had disappeared in their holes. A powerful moral spring was living in Monsieur. Adversity could make it waver, but not bring it down. Monsieur was an oak. It had the build and the strength. But when the storm blew, this oak became a reed. 11 sat for hours on the floor, eyes vague, head between his palms. He stayed long empty of thoughts. And when phrases broke up in his head again, they were very simple words, an odd inner poem, which, by its insignificance and even flexibility, resisted the winds of misfortune. I am a soft rag, soft rag, soft rag. All is equal to me since I sit well. This spacesuit is comfortable. I no longer have to make any effort, and it's nice. The grass has rustled. That's weird. I was barely thirsty, but the fatigue of getting up prevents me from going for a drink. I'll go later. After a long time, he lazily got up and went around the rock. He reached a door and couldn't open it. He sat in the grass, hypnotized by its color, watched for a long time as a small insect struggled with a twig, yawned, lazily searched for the other sayers. This opened. If he had resisted, Monsieur would still be sitting, very calm. But he could enter the rocket. Indifferent, blasé by other disasters, he explored the machine from end to end. Everything was upside down and inside out. Monsieur noted the mess without surprise or rebellion. He removed his spacesuit. He searched for something to drink. He drank. He found a bed that was more or less comfortable. He stretched out full length. His hand hung over the edge of the bed and brushed the floor. His fingers touched something. He looked at the object and recognized a somniferous tube. He took a strong dose of it. He fell into oblivion. He woke up in the darkness, remained immobile for a long time. He felt around him, found his helmet, and switched on its light. With the helmet in hand, he sought other lights and gathered them in an easily accessible place. Then he examined the damage one by one. The Ansin was still functional. The energy reserve seemed intact. Monsieur speculated on the future. Without passion, like an indifferent spectator of his own destiny. His checks gave him assurance. He could live for another 2 years. A part of the energy necessary for the rocket's launch remained to him as an inheritance. He thought about it with detachment and decided to save as much as possible. To eliminate any potential loss by induction, he cut the unnecessary electrical derivations from his solitary stay. He organized himself to live in a single cabin, as close as possible to the usable locker, placed at his reach everything he might need. He adjusted the oxygen regenerator for the needs of one man. This precaution reminded him of Jolt. He excused himself mentally to the dead man, put on a helmet, and armed himself with a shovel. He went out and climbed the slope. The red lizards buzzed around him. He split their ranks without looking at them. He didn't realize that she was turning almost ritually around Jolt's corpse death. Unconscientiously, he found himself revisiting the gestures of his childhood, educated by priests. When the grave was covered, he stood before it for a good while, arms outstretched. And gradually, his artificial solitariness turned real. A deep calm, a perfect tranquility of mind settled within him. Mysterious and beneficial waves washed away all anxiety from his mind. As he emerged from a kind of torpor, he realized that the lizards had frozen around him. Standing on their hind legs, they copied his stance and stretched out their other limbs parallel to their bodies. They didn't take their eyes off Monsieur. Monsieur wondered if he owed them this mental comfort, close to religious ecstasy. He spent 2 more days refining his organization. Then he seriously thought about it for the first time since the accident. Well, he said to himself, I can repair the rocket. I'm sure of that. The question of the lost fuel is a bit trickier, but within sin, and sometime all hope is not lost. But here's the real problem. Time. I have everything. I say, well, everything to carry out and alone a giant work. Everything except time. Or rather, no. All except sufficient energy reserve for me to live during the necessary time. Energy first. I have examined the problem from all sides. Strictly speaking, I can find a new source of energy. but that would require complicated installations which would require time. It's a vicious circle, and I'm not going to get out of it. Why energy? For three things: eating, drinking, and especially breathing. How can I cut my expenses, i.e. my activity? If I sleep as much as possible, I'll last longer. But why last under such condition? Sleep is provisional death. It was enough to die at once. No, he said to himself, it is still a possibility. He abandoned the project of a new attempt on the air. He set two goals: prevent the men of his race from knowing his situation, last as long as possible, so that they have time to save him. 8 days later, a small, fragile phrase ran from here to there in the vast space, looking for a human ear with a subtle and inexhaustible perseverance. F. 1313. Accidenta survivor impossible to specify position for 1313. Accidenta survivor. Impossible to specify position. Indeed, the thick chlorine atmosphere had always prevented any observations. And when Monsieur thought he could still escape the embrace of this planet, he planned to check in space. Now let's sleep, decided Monsieur. Drunk with drugs, he lived for weeks, sleeping, eating, drinking, and barely breathing, lying motionless in a torpid way. He finally woke up, having used all his tubes of sedative. A little scared by his loneliness, he broke without consulting the automatic calendar. He refrained from calculating reserves. He didn't want to know if death was close. Death would take him by surprise. It was better than the long anxiety of waiting for the days following the high bears, he thought again. I slept, he told himself. Well, I have preserved energy at the expense of the emitter. Does every minute of my life steal an emissary segment from a plot of energy? Every moment of emission steals a piece of my life. Should I, from his calculations, he deduced that he had slept for 15 days. He was relieved, having believed himself to be closer to the fatal deadline. He shrugged and called himself a coward. He had wanted to ignore the approach of his end. What folly! Ignorance never paid. He would act like a man, with all his conscience. He lost himself in the figures and found that the transmitter could work 100 years without interruption if it devoted all the remaining energy to it. So did he have to die? No, he had a fantastic plan. This planet was still young, probably destined for geological disturbances. An easy place must be found. Messier thinks of fortifications, sturdy cages to keep him safe from the outside dangers. Images of acropolises and defensive hedges flash through his mind. He has pity for the fragile mud walls of the lizards' nests. Acropolis. He looks up at the hill. Cage! He sees the carcass of the monster and its solid ribs resembling the columns of a temple. Look where they had to live. The rocket, already broken, was rotting at the edges of the cracks. Gradually, the winds of chlorine would dissolve the partitions, form acids to eat the internal joints, conduits, delicate organs. In a few years, the rocket would be nothing but a small pool of colorful chlorides, soon mixed with the earth, maybe carried away by an equinox tide. The ocean was not far, and many cataclysms could result from that. The eyes of Messier returned to the hill. He would have preferred a mountain. Without doubt there were some. But where? A long journey was out of the question. He would be content with the hill. The skeleton of the monster reminded him of something unpleasant. The other monster. This kind of flying ceratosaur which had only made a single incursion but might well return. Him or another, or several, the huge and silent, The skeleton of the dead monster would defend it against living monsters. Bravely, Messier rushed toward the rocket and cut his bridges. He tore away wires, stripped away casings, and pulled out strange and precious boxes, rich in secret life. Energy pods. He pulled them from the rocket, as one would pluck seeds from a rotten fruit, to save the most valuable, the promises of the future. One by one, with great effort, he lifted them to the top of the hill, beneath the gigantic carcass. He set them in a line. Then he climbed the antenna and connected it to them. It was necessary to protect everything. Messier rummaged through the undamaged boot and found what he wanted. He scrambled up the slope, leaving Hercules with an enormous bottle on his shoulder. He positioned the bottle in a good position and pressed his foot on a metal trigger. A powdery jet, a colloidal mist, sprouted from the outlet, coating the device with a pale blue snow, which, little by little, hardened into a transparent and solid sleeve around the batteries and the emitter, like an ice block. 108. This mortar was intended for other uses, especially to preserve rare samples collected across the worlds. And so, thought Messier, the transmitter will work for 100 years. It's more than enough. He shrugged and turned back to the rocket. He couldn't take a step without being followed or celebrated by 1,000 lizards. He had to watch where he put his feet so as not to hurt his little companions. He remembered their strange powers. "You should help me," he shouted at them. Then he felt a shock when he realized that he had been carrying... that the lizards had supported him in this gigantic effort and had lessened for him weights that would normally have crushed him. He thanked them silently. He mounted all the drums of the cart beneath the skeleton of the monster and arranged them in a fan to sweep a wide area. A system of ropes coiled into a single rope would allow him to empty all the available mortar with just one pull. He was finished. Everything was ready for what he wanted to do. A nearly spent oxygen stack renewed the pre-sac oxygen and heat. He decided to live only in the suit until the end. The pre-sac would only serve as a changing room if he wanted to wash or eat. He would no longer stay there. It belonged to the outside life now. He counted the scuba tanks. 12. That was about 24 days of normal living ahead of him. With a clear mind, he decided to make it a vacation. He roamed among the lizards, helped them with their small repairs of the walls, taught them a few little things. For example, he taught them about the wheel, the first human invention. Disdaining the easy solution of giving them ready-made wheels, he showed them how to cut wood into planks, how to attach an axle, how to build a cart. He also made them small windmills, and as they were already sailing on rough rafts, he made sails for them with sturdy leaks. These games brought him back to the pleasures of childhood. He felt very happy, free from all worry about the future. But time passed quickly, and when his hand only found a pile at the bottom of his pocket, a passing anxiety gripped him. Messier had a shower and fasted. To satisfy his hunger, he swallowed huge amounts of non-nutritive fiber, which only served to bulk out the standard food portion. He popped 2 sleeping pills he found in a corner of the room, but hesitated before swallowing them. Slowly, with regret, he climbed the hill for the final time. He paused for a moment, but a glance at the gauge on his helmet told him that he had no choice but to go on. He lay down by the oxygen tank, surrounded by 10 canisters aimed at him. With a firm hand, he pulled the cord. A cloud of steam enveloped him, obscuring the world around him. His hand held open all 10 spitting canisters. Slowly he saw his snow cloak lighten, allowing the weak daylight to penetrate. Soon he found himself resting in the middle of a solid block of glass. The resin was polymerizing, and when he tried to let go of the rope, his clenched fingers remained stuck in their place. He was definitely locked inside the crystal, like a relic, a great distance across time and space. A memory came to him in his last moments. Naid's face, her eyes, her smile, her hands, her body. He realized that he had not thought of her for weeks. Absorbed by vital, immediate tasks, he had not once mentioned this distant love. He discerned a tender reproach in the eyes of the phantom. He had an apologetic smile. His features softened, molded by forgotten tenderness, at the bottom of his glass sarcophagus. Under 10 tons of transparent rock, he felt very close to Nade. His gisant attitude reminded him of Nade dead. He heard the choir of priests and the lamentations of parents. His senses recreated the funeral odors and the quality of gloomy hues, rigor in the bereaved homes. He threw himself into mathematics and space like throwing oneself into water. He felt a bit cold. The battery was running low. After, it would be oxygen. He couldn't wait any longer. Soon the cold from outside would overwhelm him, freeze him for a long time, perhaps forever. He swallowed the 2 pills and slowly lost consciousness. He murmured, "I'm coming, Nade." He closed his eyes. At his feet, inaudibly and obstinately, a small phrase escaped by jerks. F-1313, accident. Accident. A survivor. Terrified, the lizards ran in all directions on the glass dome, but Nasir could no longer see them. In the transmitter, some foreign molecules were stagnant. A tiny wire became oxidized. Current no longer flowed through it. The little sentence was silent for thousands of years. One day a quake shook the mound. The coil of the transmitter vibrated and unraveled some wire. It lengthened by several hundredths of a millimeter and touched the break. The sentence has been translated as, "The little phrase was revived." Gil leaned over the slates. He examined them one by one before putting them away with a collector's patience. "So?" asked Carey. "Fine for me," said Gil calmly. "Ask the base." Carey glanced at the screen. The huge vapor ball looked more like an Angora ball than a planet. Carey had headphones on and gave the call sign 4 or 5 times before he got a response. He spoke, "Hello, base. Is that you, John?" "No," said a cavernous voice. "This is the great snake of space." A roar followed, then a laugh. Carey didn't have a sense of humor. As an excuse, one must admit that John's humor was a bit crude. "Let's get serious," said Carey, raising a shoulder. "Tell the old man that Gil is willing to go. We're just waiting for orders." "Okay, brother. I'll talk to Grand Sachem. He's strong. He's crafty. He has the wisdom of the Grey Bear." Carey, exasperated, launched a vulgarity. "The word sous des kilomètres d'espace avant d'arriver jusqu'à John on Planet 8, said John in an affected tone. "I won't talk to you anymore, coarse character." Carey had the commander on direct. He talked to him for 10 minutes. The commander asked some precise questions. He finally said, "Go ahead. I envy you, my old man. It's not always pleasant to be in the rear when you've got a 20-year-old soul. Well, let the youngsters have their say. Good luck." The entire crew was brimming with anticipation. They were finally going to unravel the mystery of Planet 9. For the past 10 years, it had intrigued humanity. All the worlds of Alpha Double had been explored, except for this one. Technical precedences had always delayed this small trip. Planet 9 was both frightening and enthralling. After all, it was pretty much certain that it hid no advanced civilizations, and yet it regularly emitted something resembling a message. And what a message! Although expressed in an unknown language, it seemed to be spoken by a human mouth. It was always the same fluid phrase, cut into 3 by tops, and everyone knew it by heart, without being able to give it a meaning. When the machine landed on an immense plain, the vibration of the reactors ceased to ping the atmosphere at its delicate organ point, and everyone knew we had arrived. The doctor on board dispensed sedatives to ease the men's nerves during initial checks, which lasted about an hour. At last, 20 individuals were chosen from the landing volunteers. They were all of them. Kari went out with them, as well as Lopez, historian, sociologist. All were armed, except Lopez. He obeyed the vow not to carry a weapon anymore, ever since fear had driven him to slaughter 3 harmless Oberon POWs he believed were threatening. One by one they went down the metal ladder and hailed, already lost in the chlorine mist. Indisciplined, a young man of 18 years had gone 20 meters away from the others. In the fog, he thought he recognized a comrade and went to him. Kari's voice rang in his ears. "Set your lamps to 18. He obeyed and turned to his neighbor. He let out a strangled cry. Standing right in front of him, a large lizard was looking at him with curiosity. The young man didn't make a move, frozen by fear. "Who cried?" said Carey. But already dozens of jumping silhouettes surrounded the men. "Retreat," the daring young man folded on his comrades. "Form a circle," said Carey, "and point your weapons. But don't shoot, especially. Just have your finger on the safety lever." Slowly, a circle formed among the lizards. Someone demanded. Carey ordered silence. He turned to Lopez. "What do you think?" the sociologist declared briefly. Then, in a calm voice, clearly pronouncing each syllable, he recited the mysterious phrase, uttered from so long ago by this planet. The circle beneath circle spun faster. A wave of mental consciousness flooded the earthlings. A wave of respectful tenderness. Everyone felt it but couldn't define it. Lopez hesitated. "Yes, telepath race. I don't like that. Do you think they're trying to fool us? I feel like they love us," Lopez finished. I believe them to be sincere. In fact, Lopez knew nothing about it. The excellent dispositions of the lizards could be a dangerous ruse, a hypocritical trap, but an old guilt complex worked on the sociologist, and he was always ready to trust the new beings. Someone condensed the general impression into a familiar formula. "They are nice." Harry cut his campaign intercom and set the cursor toward the rocket. He informed Gil and requested 20 more men. The small group expanded. However, more lizards were arriving. They came in crowds from a small valley on the right. Carey left 10 men at the door of the passageway. He led the others towards the valley. The lizards followed. Warm waves of friendly approval flowed from the crowd. They were jumping a little like kangaroos, which were roughly the same size as them. A lizard a little redder than the others caught Lopez's attention. The animal was holding something in its paw. Lopez shouted, "Wait a minute." Then he approached the lizard and reached out his hand toward the object. He thought hard. "Give it to me. Give it to me." The beast hesitated for a moment, then gently placed the thing in the sociologist's hand. It was a staff encasing at mid-shaft a kind of sharp crystal. "My word," Lopez exclaimed. "It looks like a Paleolithic axe." "I believe we can go safely forward," he said to Kari. "Their civilization is too primitive to present any danger." Kari made a gesture of doubt and telepathy. The sociologist shook his head. "Don't worry. They won't do you any harm. If they are telepathic, they will sense that we are good-natured towards them. And since the aggression of savage people often comes from fear, I repeat that I believe them to be sincere. They seem too primitive to feign so much. I can see no flaw in their sympathy. And then, after all, double or not, it would always end in axes that wouldn't even scratch our helmets. Let's push the experience to the limit. He returned the weapon to the lizard and added, "It is the only one who has one of these. The men from Paleolithic would have been much more cautious. And do you think that either of them would have confided their toy with such good grace to me? Maybe. I doubt it. He would have given me a blow on the skull." Kari smiled discreetly, out of the range of his choker. A racial masochism always blew on Lopez, a severe verdict for Homo sapiens. "This conquering brute," he said. At the bend of a hill, a town appeared in front of the Earthling's eyes. A wooden town, it seemed, with palisades of logs, bridges thrown across a river of chlorine, and countless mills towering over the roofs. The Earthling suddenly faltered under an immense cacophony of welcome. A silent cacophony that stirred latent and untrained abilities within them. Blasts of love and religious reverence flew from all directions. 1,000 questions swirled in Lopez's head. Stone hammers and mills, anecdotal, that several prior experiences had taught him to sort extraterrestrial civilizations without preconceived ideas. In the halo of novel sensations, his senses registered precise images, carts loaded with enigmatic goods, ropes grating against pulleys at the top of the towers, geometric ornaments at the prow of ships whose paddle wheels clattered on the river, propelled by 10 lizards simultaneously. And then he saw the Acropolis. This is the least of what suddenly came to his mind before this abrupt and protected height of triple pales. It dominated the city and raised strange columns on the verdant horizon. Kari was already indicating the monument to him. "I've seen it," said Lopez. But Kari also pointed out the metal box he wore strapped to his belly. "That's coming from over there," he said. Lopez was overwhelmed and didn't immediately understand what then. The shows, by God. Wasn't worth all that effort to land nearby if you've already forgotten them. A wide road climbed in a spiral towards the temple. On this road, 3 chariots grumbled as they met the men. Roaring wheelbarrows dragged by flocks of birds. The reddish crowd parted for them. When men wanted to step aside their turns, the chariots stopped, leech-like drivers breaking the birds' flight with a sudden tight knot. Giant birds fell one after another on their knees, waving in a ridiculous manner their winglets. Then they sadly shook their heads, embarrassed by the leather sheath constricting their beaks. Chariots leapt. Colorful lizard-like creatures clad in bark prostrated before the Terrans who were taken aback. "Word," said Carl. "We are greeted as the Messiah." "Be wary of too human interpretations," warned Lopez. "Nothing says that this posture corresponds to them in a prostration. Had you noticed their clothes? The others were naked." "I don't think it's proper clothing. I would say it's sacerdotal ornaments." Lopez smiled. "You've got ideas for a military man," he said. The tanks made a half-turn. A lizard with jointed limbs, its members ringed with colorful rings, beckoned the men to climb on board. "Not again, I don't like that," said Kari. "I doubt they will give us a great honor, but some populations believe to please you by sacrificing you on their altars." "Do not be ridiculous," protested the sociologist. "They are not armed." Curiosity and caution fought in Kari's mind. "Well," he said ungraciously, "I wonder what we'll find up there." "We're here for that," she replied. "Go ahead," Kari told his men. "Keep your safety on, but keep the weapon at the ready." As the tanks rumbled and creaked to life, Kari linked up with the rocket. He told the story in a spare style, almost telegraphic. "Send the sphere." he concluded before clutching at the curtains, shaken by bumps unimaginable. The chariots took the bends with daring that did credit to their drivers. They reached the summit and jumped onto the ground at the same time as the sphere coming from the rocket began to glide above them. Carrie looked up at the craft. "I feel calmer now," he said. "We're covered." 10 combat helicopters could rise from the sphere on a whisper. Lopez's heart was pounding as he looked down at the flight of 50 steps leading to the temple. Was it a temple? "It looks like," stuttered he. "A whale skeleton," completed Carrie. "A whale that would be over 1 kilometer long." Carrie thought he was joking, but his hypothesis was a light for Lopez. He opened his mouth but remained without voice, too amazed to articulate any sound. "In a dream." He climbed the stairs and found himself under the vault, beforeing his astonishment. They were in a room with an open sky. A fresco adorned the walls. "Wow," said Carrie, stunned. The skeleton of a monster was reproduced in bright colors at one end of the fresco, but a terrifying drawing. "Amazing," murmured Lopez. A man in a spacesuit was painted alongside the monster cathedral. Then there were balls containing small germs. And then we saw further that the germs specified their forms, becoming a kind of lava resembling, to look at it from all angles, the monster itself, or at least its general structure, and then the balls were represented open like term eggs and released. Lizards. "This is all the lizards' phylogeny that we see here," Lopez says. "This is the story of their race, and that race begins with a whale, and we dream." Carrie let out a nervous laugh. "How can we tell if we're dreaming?" he said. "With these damn helmets on, we can't pinch each other." "It's impossible," groaned the historian. "He is not a man, but a 4-legged creature whose luck. We are the first on this planet." The soldiers whispered among themselves as they examined the frescoes. The lizards beckoned them to move further ahead. They entered a second room where more frescoes awaited, depicting a man holding birds in his hands, as if he were fighting crows. Farther on, the mysterious being was caressing lizards, leaning over the ground to plant little windmills there, seemingly cutting wheels with a penknife and indulging in thousands of dolls' games with the lizards. They were tiny ones and climbed up his boots. "They're baby lizards," says Carrie. "I don't think so," says Lopez, throwing a glance at the priestesses who came up to his chest. "The primitives always represent the characters they revere, rulers, kings or gods, in larger-than-life size." In this way, they give them moral size. They enter a third room. "Oh, fit Carrie, je crois que nous sommes dans le Saint des Saints." The room was immense. The bony arches forming the vault gave it a solemn majesty. In the middle rose an altar-like dome covered with a veil. "By bloody hell," said Carrie as he looked at the screens on his box. "Never has the transmission been so strong." "I put it in phonics. Listen." He turned a button. A human voice, monotonous and precise, intoned the mystery phrase with grandeur. The men looked at each other, pale behind their glass windows. But the lizards were unfurling the altar, a round, transparent mass from which something vague could be discerned, as if distorted by a giant lens. Emboldened beyond measure, the men climbed up on the slippery altar with a short ladder. Lopez and Carrie were crouching on all fours over the gigantic crystal. They lay back on their backs in sparkling spacesuits, their eyes closed behind their windows, and they saw a man. Yes, a man 6 meters tall. 3 weeks had passed. The sacred hill was buzzing with men in spacesuits. The rockets from the base had poured them out by hundreds. The Acropolis had taken on the appearance of a vast camp. Far from suffering from this invasion, the lizards seemed to be exulting. In the night of centuries, men had been announced by obscure prophecies. Lopez doubted it. They welcome us well because we strangely resemble their god, he declared. Then he lost himself in hypotheses about the origin of the giant mummy. Specialists had trouble finding a way to begin breaking up the sacred crystal block. Eventually they discovered what it was made of. Resin from an incredibly long and complex formula, practically impervious to even the strongest acids. Mechanical means were useless against it. 20 other methods might well have been able to achieve this, but without risk of damage to the relic. They devised a projector capable of separating molecules, and the opening of the tomb was decided upon. The mass melted away at an alarming rate. It flowed in rivulets between the legs of the attentive scientists. Little by little, the giant's helmet emerged from its encasing. Lopez, without confiding in anyone out of fear of ridicule, had secretly thought that the tall stature of the dead man was just an optical illusion due to special qualities of the resin, but there was nothing to it. The unknown man really had surprising dimensions. His regular-featured face seemed to smile imperceptibly. It was indeed the face of a man, but what would one find? Inside the helmet, what body did he have? It would be extraordinary if he resembled men in every respect. Already, the specialists were busy with the strange transmitter apparatus, completely disassembled. Masir dreamed that he was lying on a sunny beach. A soft light weighed on his eyelids. The cold had penetrated his limbs. The heat emanating from the searchlight had exhausted the reserves of the oxygen bottle in his helmet. He breathed air charged with ozone. Shouts of surprise rang in his ears. Children must have been playing on the beach, he thought. An idea was resting next to him. He imagined Naidi lying on a black and gold robe, her wet hair serpenting down her bare shoulders. He reached out a hand to touch her, but he felt his muscles go limp under the helmet. Suddenly, he blinked open his eyes and raised his head, crying out, "Naid!" In a red haze, all he saw was a dozen dwarves retreating in fear. The dwarves in diving suits. Disoriented, very weak, he leaned on an elbow. He uttered a few words without consequence, then was seized with a brutal constriction and fell face down. "Do something!" Lopez cried as he shook a doctor by the shoulder. This one sadly shook his head. "If only we had suspected it," he regretted. "We believed him dead, and it was almost as if he were crying." "Can't something be done?" the historian insisted. The doctor gave orders, but it took a good half-hour to carry Masir on a makeshift stretcher. He was hoisted into the hold of a crane, like some kind of commodity, and another 2 hours were lost getting him out of a spacesuit whose opening method was unknown. The doctor penned on his shoulder. "The autopsy," he said. Naked, Masir's muscular body rested directly on the floor. A sheet covered the wounds caused by the autopsy. The doctor was finishing a short report. "Thrombosis of the right atrial appendage. I'm sorry, gentlemen. 3/4 of hibernation accidents take place during warming up. This one was too brutal due to the spotlight." A colonel posed an unfinished question, but one that burned on all lips. Was it? It was a man. Only his size sets him apart from us. But it's not an acromegalian monster like those on display in circuses. It was absolutely normal, and "I'm sorry," he said, lowering his head. "I am deeply affected. When I think of the immense loss we've suffered because of this stupid accident." He made a gesture towards the historian. "Lopez will tell you better than me. He has an extraordinary revelation to communicate with you. Tell them what you know, old man." Sitting on a crate, Lopez seemed to emerge from a dream. He stood as if he were drunk. From his drawn features and red eyes, One would have sworn that he had just lost a member of his family. Effie showed papers in his hand. "I have all the proof," he said. "I found all this in the dead man's pockets. Cars, personal papers covered with an unknown writing, and, well, many more things of which I will give you details later." He frowned at the paperwork. This man had a tattoo on his chest of a circle and a snake gear, but he kept silent before them the conviction of Lopez, who presented to them the facts in a disorganized way. He was a Terrian like us. He had on him maps of Earth, or the continents had about the same shape as today. Gentlemen, this man belonged to a more advanced civilization than ours. He could have confided us fantastic secrets. He came from Earth, I have already said. His writing presents certain analogies with Egyptian writing and even some Mayan characters. "You are exalted," Lopez cut the incredulous colonel. "A saintly anger animates the historian, really," he said. "Ask the specialists the age of this diver. Ask the doctors," he choked. "You have before you the last representative of the race that civilized the earliest Egyptians and Mayas of America, who lived on this now vanished continent." As he said this, he struck suddenly at the map with his finger, which sank beneath the Atlantic. The Earth was turning in a different direction at that time, as these inverted sky maps prove. "You hear me, Colonel, inverted, but strictly accurate," he said with a vibrant tone. This race traveled through space and taught the ancient ones the very basics of architecture which led them to the pyramids, while our ancestors were still nothing more than bearded apes. This race was wiped out by a catastrophe before it had transmitted all its knowledge to the peoples it taught. It looked at the others with a kind of solemn severity. "Salute, gentlemen. Salute an old man over 10,000 years." Impressed, they all discovered themselves one after the other. Even the colonel, who remembered too late that saluting was not official in the army. "This giant," said Lopez. This giant was everyone fixed on him, waiting for his last word. He said in almost a whisper, with a tone of religious reverence, "An atlas